I'm live. We'll see how the connection is. Last time I had to hotspot it through my phone. So I usually like to make videos on Saturday or Sunday night, and I realized today was the Super Bowl, and so I was like, oh, well, I shouldn't make a video because it's the Super Bowl. For those of you watching in the future, this is an hour into the contest. But then I realized I really don't like the Super Bowl or football, so I should do an anti-Super Bowl video for the very few people in America anyway who are having something better to do than watch that. So, hey visitor, I'm doing well. How are you? Hope you had a good weekend. Mine was pretty good, all in all. Do, do, do. Perfect. Everything looks good. So, football, I think, is interesting because it's the most popular sport in America. Um, but I've always found it fascinating in a cultural sense. Um, I hit some PRs at the gym yesterday. Awesome. On what lifts? I won't ask you what the PRs were, but on what lifts? Well, so uh, yeah, no, I didn't hit a PR today, but I'm getting back into lifting and I'm getting back to my, I'm not making new records, but I'm getting back to my records or back to my where I left off, which feels good. Fortunately, it does not take that long to regain what you lost relative to making it in the first place. And so today was squats. And today was the first day I got back to where I left off, which felt really good. So, anyway, football, I remember I never played football, obviously, but I was in marching band. And one of the things that always struck me, even as a kid, was the amount of tribalism that's involved. People got really, really into it, very much an us versus them, and it was kind of silly because you were talking about, this was a small rural school playing an adjacent small rural school where, the economy, the culture, and the society is basically 99% the same, and yet they're, uh, dire enemies on the gridiron. And I always found that was a little unsettling, and I also really found it really unsettling the degree to which people take vicarious pleasure in football. Now, this is really true with all sports, team sports, or even individual sports, and a whole bunch of other things like just celebrities and Hollywood and movies and stuff. But the degree to which people felt like they had accomplished something or they were good because the football team did well or didn't do well. I guess it's fair to say that people are more likely to feel good when the football team does well than they are to feel bad when the football team does poorly, which at my high school, the football team did poorly pretty much all the time. Actually, so consistently poorly that it's fascinating that in 100 years a school can just be consistently bad like that. Yep, somehow my high school managed to do that, even though it was competitive in other sports. But uh, so then you look at football in college, and you have this whole other set of questions about amateur athleticism, about being pro, about the ethics of how the colleges treat the players. And of course, this varies from school to school. There's plenty of schools where the football team is just like a club team and they're not getting scholarships and they're not being placed under high demands. And there's others where I believe the numbers are something like at a Division I school, each player is worth about $300,000 to the school, or that's what their salary should be based on market rates. I don't know how you would actually calculate that, but apparently that is the case, and that raises lots of questions because the vast majority of those players obviously don't become professionals, although all of them, or a very large number of them, probably are aspiring to that. And not only are they are getting scholarships to go to school, but most of them are not getting marketable degrees or even graduating. And most of them are doing damage to their body to one degree or another. And that is the third interesting thing, is that it seems like uh, these compound minor concussions that they have thousands of, tens of thousands of for pros raises serious kind of health questions that are kind of interesting ethically. Like, what should people be allowed to play a sport that is going to have cumulative damage on their cognitive abilities? And we know that with some degree of certainty. Let's say that if we know that with some degree of certainty, that the NFL obviously is disputing a lot of that, and the science isn't 100%. Uh, you're not very patriotic. You're supposed to be drinking Bud Light and watching government-approved sports ball. Yeah, that's the other interesting thing, is the degree to which the states subsidize it. Um, Subsidized stadiums are kind of a classic boondoggle, an example of the fluidity of the term common good. Um, there are people who could make common good arguments based on economics, basically things that are public goods, things that are non-excludable. This would be like defense. I don't know if the defensive armaments that we have today make this really true, but let's say you had a force field that defended a country, and well, everyone is defended as a result of that, and there's no real way to have the force field not protect some people. Let's just assume the technology doesn't allow that, although if we're talking about force fields, who knows, maybe that would be possible. Um, but so then you make the argument, well, that's a public good, that's not something that's excludable, there's free rider problems, blah, 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 ergo government, whatever. Um, but what's fascinating, even if we concede that point and concede that particular argument, which I'm not sure I'm ready to do, I think there are decent counter arguments. But then what almost immediately follows then is a rhetoric that basically allows for anything, not just stuff that's public good, not just stuff that's not excludable, but literally anything. And that can end up meaning billion-dollar subsidies to billionaires to have football stadiums. So, yeah, yeah, billionaires getting richer through publicly funded stadiums. What a joke. Yeah, that's exactly true. And yet, even very socialist, left-wing, progressive Democrats will make that argument. Squat. Yeah, so I did squats today, and I'm not feeling it yet, so that's good. But I got back to my deadlift limit yesterday, or not yesterday, but I think on Thursday or Friday. And I don't have a spotter, so I haven't done chest yet. So I'm still looking for a chest person to help me with that. I really do prefer having a spotter for barbell press. I guess I could do dumbbells, but I like doing the bar. So, are you doing the 6 days a week like you planned? I'm going to the gym 6 or 7 days a week. I'm not lifting 6 or 7 days. I'm lifting more like 3 or 4 days a week. But jujitsu 5 days a week, cardio, like the walking, at least 10 to 20 miles a day, 5 to 6 days a week. So I'm pretty active. Uh, duh, duh, duh. I live in Alabama. College football is huge here. The amount of money those athletes aren't getting is criminal. Yeah, there's something to be said for amateur sports for sure. There's an argument there, but to the degree that which collegiate football is, that is kind of questionable. And I guess before I get on too many tangents here, I did do a video, oh wow, 5 or 6 years ago, called "Football Sport of Fools" or something like that, and it's based on ESPN longtime contributor. I think his name is Eggsberger or something like that. Huge fan of football, where he's coming from this from a perspective of love, but pointing out all of the numerous problems with it. And he's not a libertarian, I don't think, but a lot of the arguments that he makes are actually fairly libertarian. Boo, boo, boo. Duh, duh. One good thing is they gave bloodstained men a chance to protest circumcision. Oh, are they at the Super Bowl game? I didn't see that. But, you know, they're fighting the good fight, and they're smart enough to do where there's an audience. Did I talk about, I think I mentioned it, like I randomly met the bloodstained men without, any kind of digital interference in Wyoming, of all places. I was out there for work, and I was about to actually drive 3 or 4 hours to Montana, and I was about to get on the highway in Gillette, Wyoming, and there, I saw one guy wearing the white with the blood stain. I thought, oh, maybe this is just one guy, like an ally or something. Pulled over, and sure enough, it was the whole group. So I got to talk to them all. I actually got interviewed by Bonobo 3 or whatever for like half an hour, which he's still not uploaded, but he warned me that that may be the case. So we'll see. Wyoming proved to be they told me that Wyoming was the most resistant state. They got the most pushback in Wyoming as they had done anywhere up to that point. It's possible since then they've had it even worse. And it was actually pretty intense. The stuff that they got. Football is the devil. Yeah, it's interesting now what's going to happen if all this medical stuff gets worse. People are going to basically, I mean, the NFL can afford it. They have the lawyers. They have the argument that these are adults that are choosing to do this. They can consent to something like this, but can an eighth grader, can a ninth grader, and can a high school or a middle school or a private team, can they afford uh, the liability of this? And it also raises the question of these are injuries that are cumulative. Well, there are injuries that happen in football that are immediate, right? People break their backs and whatever, overheat. I think most of those injuries are relatively rare, especially the more serious ones. Also, cheerleading is apparently very dangerous too. Cheerleading is one of the highest injury sports. But what about injuries that don't really manifest in the near term but are cumulative in the long term? And if there's something where you say you get these minor traumas that they get from playing football, and say doing it for 3 or 4 years, you get the injuries, but there's probably not going to be any ill effect. But if you do them for 8 or 9 years, there is, right? And I don't think the research is yet there to tell us what the answer to those questions is, but it would be kind of interesting to see what then becomes the ethics of participating. Uh, d- 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 uh, bu- bu- John, I do not speak the language. What language? Bred in circuses. Oh. Yeah, America convinces people to do lots of bad things very easily through the media. Although I do not think that Americans are any, more susceptible to this than most people. But they're certainly susceptible to it. But, not having safeties for bench is terrible, even if you have a spotter. You should find a different gym with a bench and a rack. Okay? So my gym does have the squat racks. You can put in the power bars and you can put a bench there, and you can definitely bench press with a rack if you want. You kind of got to do some moving around, but it's allowed. But I just much prefer a spotter. Yeah, the brain injury thing is real in football, and these guys weren't too bright to begin with. Well, most of them maybe not, and I mean, he talks about it in the book Sport of Kings, how if they're in the NFL, it meant when they went to college, very few of them were studying something that might pan out as an actual career. His kind of take is he doesn't want them to be paid, but he thinks that the school should offer them additional semesters for free, or in addition to, whenever they don't go to the NFL, so that they can actually get a degree that might matter. But again, that's like I don't know. That's like pulling the ejection sheet, at the last second when they've been on trajectory for something else. It's stuff like that. It's very interesting because basically to make it in that sport, that's something you have to basically start very early. It's something that you're preparing for, like as a kid, and very seriously for many years, for decades, or a decade and a half or 2 decades, and uh, there now is apparently a high risk. Now, even there's a risk for physical injuries. I won't say it's high, but let's say there's a risk for physical injuries. There's a much bigger risk that it's just not going to pan out, right? And that's unlike other careers, right? There are other careers where you might not get the best job or the number one job, but at least you'll have something you can fall back on, and there really isn't that much of a fallback with football. I mean, obviously, coaching other football teams or maybe going into some kind of physical fitness, but the skills that they were developing for the gridiron are not necessarily applicable for all those. So it is an interesting thing, and I do think we're starting to see much more, and this is bad, I would say in a lot of ways, but we have um, more directed parenting where parents are kind of laying out a roadmap for their kids to follow more or less rigidly. and which you kind of have to do if you want a kid to become a football player. That's necessary. And I guess it would be kind of interesting to see what kind of families go for that, right? If you are from a family that's wealthy and cultured and whatever, what are the odds that they're going to push one of their kids to become a football player? And the answer is probably not very many. Whereas, and they see their path to success being to go to Harvard or go to Yale or some of their Ivy and to become a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. But if you're poorer or you're from a certain minority groups, especially blacks, it would be seen by many of them, well, the path forward is to be really good at football or basketball. And that's the targeted group. But again, that's basically a giant gamble because I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but for every high school football player, I think it's something like I think 3 or 4% of them will make it into like a good like a decent college league, so not like a sports team, and then it's like 1% of those will make it to the NFL. So there's a huge cutoff, and most of the NFL players, you always hear about, oh, hundreds of millions this, tens of millions that. Well, those are the absolutely best paid players. I think the minimum wage in the NFL, it's higher than I last checked, but it's a couple $100,000 a year, which sure, that's very good for one year, but considering that the average career is 3 years, and considering that you do have people like Brett Favre who are in there for multiple years, that means that you have a lot of players who are playing for a season or a part of a season. And yes, $300,000 is nice for that, but if your whole life was bent on this one chance to be in the NFL and you made it and you got a 300,000 payoff, 20 years of work and wrecking your health for $300,000 or even $1 million is not that huge of a payout. And considering that many of these people will have kind of internalized the idea that you need to be flashy and the reason you're in the NFL is to make a lot of money, most of them waste it all, basically. And something like a third of NFL players become bankrupt because their time preference is just way too high. Is it is interesting. To what extent do you think school liable to CTE type injuries? How different is that from long-term cumulative damage from other things like sitting 8 hours at a day? Yeah, that's a good point. Um, yeah, I think these are actually really valid ethical questions because now there is I I think that some of the important points here though are they liable if they had no idea? And I think the answer to that is probably no, right? If CTE was unknown, and this is hotly debated because there is evidence that the NFL knew something about it, but when exactly and how much isn't known. Did your local high school know about it? Probably not. I doubt that there was some sinister secret circular going around through all the principals and athletic departments saying, here's this thing called CTE and we're probably liable, and they kept doing it. If that was true, they would be much more liable than in the more likely scenario of they don't know. But now that they do know at least something, how much are they liable? And that is very, very good question. And also, we don't, I mean, again, is CTE happening to anyone who played high school football at all, or do you really need to go? Do you really need, in the documentary, I think they were saying some of the people who really suffer from it, they were getting like 70,000 hits. And that requires you basically to go through college. So is that happening to high school players who only do high school, who only do a year or two of college? And I don't know that they know an answer to that. Um, because there's lots of things you could start a hobby. Um, it's fascinating because it is a cumulative injury, right? So, it's one thing you could say, oh, I'm going to do equestrian, right? So a lot of schools have equestrian. Well, equestrian can be quite dangerous, right? You're riding a horse falls, you can break your neck and end up like Christopher Reeves, right? But they're not cumulative injuries. So you make it through high school, you never get injured in high school, you're fine. You go to college, you're fine. And then when you're 35, you fall off your horse on your club equestrian team and you break your back. Can you sue your school? Well, probably not because you didn't get, well, I joined the team in high school and that's when I got into it. Yeah, but you didn't get any injuries then. You got injuries way after. CTE seems different because it seems like it's cumulative. If you get it from the NFL, you also got it because you were in high school and because you were in college. So it does raise some really interesting questions that have not been litigated really at this point. And the NFL is probably going to do a lot to make it hard to litigate, although not impossible, because the NFL, because it has so much money, also makes itself a target of litigation. This is to kind of go into a tangent here about tort law and anarchist theory. because people will make arguments like, well, you need to have the government run the law because what about poor people? Poor people won't be served in a system that's based, a system of justice that's based on restitution and private law because you can't afford a lawyer, blah blah blah. And I think that this is really misplaced because if you have a claim against somebody, if you've been wronged, say you're just a poor homeless person and a very powerful organization harms you, and this is serious harm, then you are potentially entitled to millions of dollars or even more, and other powerful firms, powerful law firms, will go and on your behalf litigate that, right? And they're not doing that because they love you and because they're charitable, although they could. I mean, there is such a thing as pro bono defense or and whatnot. But you just say, hey, we will defend you, and if you get a settlement, we get 40% or whatever it is. And you may balk at that, but then they are getting the defense. And then it's not the little guy versus the big guy. It's the big guy on the little guy's behalf. And for those of you who are interested, David Friedman's paper on Viking Age Iceland or the book Viking Age Iceland talks about this because that is basically the system you had there. You had these, what they called Govr, which were powerful men. They were basically litigators, and they could sue each other, and you could sue them. But if a powerful Govr did wrong to you, you might be, well, I don't want to sue this guy. Well, you go to another powerful Govr and say, hey, you know, Helgi over there, he killed my daughter or raped my son or whatever. And I don't have the financial clout to go against him. Well, you go against him, and then if we win, then obviously they may not share like a 40% like we would do because I don't know that they were really using a money economy to the extent that we would, but some other kind of transactional thing would go on to get justice. Um, so, do you think there is a joining of the vegan and activist movements in America? No. Now, there is a high correlation. A lot of intactivists are vegans. Um, I also get this question a lot about abortion, which is fascinating because most intactivists, in my experience, are pro-choice, which I think does not make sense. I think that there is a contradiction there. I think you can basically explode their brains. If you have a pro-choice intactivist, ask them, can you circumcise a fetus? And they're going to say no. But then if you say, can you rip its arms off and suck its brains out? They'll say yes. Maybe. So no, I don't think, I think that they're different enough that there isn't a convergence there, even though there is an overlap in terms of people. There have been lots of vegan YouTubers that have been championing activism. Yeah, I think that's, I mean, it kind of makes sense if you believe you don't want to do harm. Like a big part of veganism is ethical questions about the treatment of animals, and they don't want to hurt animals. And if you don't want to hurt animals, then you're not anti-human, which, it's fair to say a lot of this environmentalism is kind of misanthropic. But if it's not misanthropic, then they could say, hey, you shouldn't kill an animal unless it's in a cornfield for your agriculture, I guess. But you can torture a baby, and I think there's lots of people who are not. I think what you're actually seeing is just a growth of the intactivist movement. Like the intactivist rhetoric is making progress. It's not to say that it's by any means a majority view at this point. It's not, but it's making headway. Uh, duh, duh, duh. Yeah, it's kind of ironic though, since a vegan diet will include suffering because it's essentially malnutrition. You need animal products to survive. Well, this is debated, but I think that that is probably true to a large extent. So, uh, it's interesting that you're tying veganism to the left. I always thought veganism was more left wing. I don't know if you're accusing me of that or of national communism that, but it does seem to correlate. So, did any of you guys ever play football? I never did. I never. It didn't even seem like a very fun sport to watch to me. I mean, the action's very short, and I can't really tell what's going on. Any updates on the game? This is a little bit different because ever since I've lived in New Hampshire, the Patriots have gone to the Super Bowl repeatedly, and since they are the team in New Hampshire, basically, it's always like a super super big deal. Like you can't even go grocery shopping, which I always found annoying. Football highlights over the full game, yeah. People say that football is the physical equivalent to chess. So I've heard that too, right? My impression when I watch it as a layperson is that it's just really huge guys just banging into each other, and that it is purely a question of mass and strength and size. And yet, one of my good friends growing up, actually the guy who coerced me or persuaded me into communal showering, so you can thank him for all of those videos, basically. He was a football player, and when I said that to him, he was like, "No, that's absolutely not true. That there's a lot of technique involved. That the way that they throw their weight around is highly advanced, and that the and of course we've all kind of heard the cliche about like the really complicated drills and they have to memorize all this stuff and this is all stuff you don't see. I mean, it just looks like they're running around to someone who doesn't know what they're doing, which is me. But apparently there is a lot of thought that goes into that. Uh, so yeah, I'm too stupid to follow football. What the hell are they doing on the field? I can't follow those rules. More Molyneux gossip, please. Did I do Molyneux gossip? The only new thing Molyneux-wise, well, he did a truth about the coronavirus, which I didn't watch. It's just so I don't know how he can continue to name stuff after that. The only thing I haven't heard anything new, but I was watching the Dave Smith clip where he was basically saying I don't see what the big problem is with with Molyneux. He seems like he's a good dude, uh, and basically his defense of him was that he doesn't think he's alt right, but the video made it sound to me like he is just completely unfamiliar with the stuff with True Sheebs, with the DMCA claims, with the stuff he did with lying to Joe Rogan's face about his wife and the defooing. Also about the defooing. The defooing is really fucked up. And Jim Jesus here has done, I think he's done videos on this that are really good. But um, the idea that um, well, if your family's being abusive to you, then you should leave them. And people will be like, well, that's fine. And like, yeah, that is fine. Leaving your family if they're abusing you isn't necessarily a bad idea. But the problem is Molyneux's definition of the abuse includes things that you might agree with, obviously, like physical abuse, and he would include spanking, and I think that's debatable, but you could definitely make a fair argument for that. But it also includes things like not believing in UPB, right? If you go to your family and you try and get them to believe in Molyneux's ethics and his philosophy, and you explain it to them, and they reject the philosophy, then he considers that also to be abuse. And the gun in the room argument. So if they don't become anarcho-capitalists, then that also is abuse. So yes, he says if your family's abusing you, you should defoo them. Um, but then his definition of abuse just extends to like all this other weird, really culty stuff. If your family doesn't believe in me, you should defoo them. If they are not anarcho-capitalists, they should defoo. Right. So it's one of those things where it sounds okay, but it's not. And then there's the fact that he just blatantly lied to Joe Rogan's face. Joe Rogan called him out on it, and he just ignored it. So there's that. There's the whole stuff where he was bitching about the donations because he has to do paperwork for each of one of them, and they're not big donations. And I think he lost a huge amount of support because of that. So again, to Dave's point, that doesn't make him a war criminal, right? And that's absolutely true. So he should never be compared to Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or any of those people or Barack Obama. God, no, he's not anything. His crimes are not that. His crimes are being a douchey, hypocritical, egotistical hypocrite. And those aren't crimes, right? I don't think he's done anything. I guess in a strict libertarian sense, you could talk about the DMCA claims because he is calling down the state on somebody for basically making him look like a jerk because the videos True Sheaves was uploading was him making claims like he's the greatest philosopher in 6,000 years. He's the greatest communicator in at least 250 years. That without him, libertarianism would go back 2,500 years. That he's the only libertarian who talks about circumcision and abortion, blah, 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 blah. Okay, basically, he's a conceited narcissist. But he called, and then there's even videos of Molyneux like bullying callers, and then True Sheaves would upload that, and then Molyneux would dox or DMCA claim saying, "Oh, well, you're bullying by doing that." So that's not new. I just think it's weird. I guess it's not weird, but maybe Smith is just a little too new hat. I mean, he's been doing this for a while, but maybe he just missed all that Molyneux controversy stuff, and so he doesn't know about it because in that whole whatever 10-15 minute video, he never talked about any of it. And I think that's the crux of most of the argument with Molyneux. I know for me personally, and I've related this story many times, it was way back in 2008 or 2009. I don't remember the exact year, but I remember I watched it in Texas, and those were the 2 years I was in Texas. And he was taking a call, and the caller asked about, well, how are you going to handle like crimes and an anarchist system? And Molyneux basically said, "Well, I invented this thing called DROs, which are firms that, they do arbitration between people, and if you have a dispute, if A and B have a dispute, they have their arbitration firms get together and blah blah blah." And as soon as he said that, I remember thinking like, okay, wait, DRO, that's a different term. I've never heard that term before, but that concept is basically been around forever, right? You have that in the insurance companies under Hans Hermann Hoppe's thinking, and I think he wrote about that in Democracy: The God That Failed in like the mid 90s. The Tannenhills wrote about that explicitly in the 1970s in The Market for Liberty, and all the way back to Gustav de Molinari in the 1870s and 1880s in the Private Production of Defense talk about that. So that concept is not a new concept. It's a fairly well fleshed out concept. Rothbard wrote a lot about it in the 60s and 70s. And so my conclusion for Molyneux's statements then is either he is unaware of all of that scholarship, in which case his authority as a libertarian speaker and scholar is quite minimal, or he is aware of that and now he's pretending like this is an innovation that he came up with. And I think the most likely explanation is the latter, although either is possible. And I just remember thinking, now, if you didn't know all of that, it would just sound like he was an amazing innovator to you. Or not, maybe not an amazing innovator, but he had come up with an innovation when in fact he had not. Now, I guess the most generous thing is he independently came up with this. But again, if that's true, that means he was completely unaware of the work of all these other people. And I don't think you have to be, a David Gordon to be that good of a scholar to know about that stuff, because that stuff was popularly published. And that was my first clue. And kind of from then on, um, you listen to everything with this understanding of like this, how much of this is bullshit. And actually, it turns out that a decent amount of it is not everything, but a decent amount. Uh, so I don't know if Smith just doesn't know all that or not. I left a comment on that video explaining it, and the I mean, one of the persons like, "Do you have any evidence that he did the DMCA claim?" And then it was funny. He said, "Do you have any evidence that Molyneux did a DMCA claim?" But then he gave Molyneux's rationalization as to why he did, and I was like, "Well, why are you asking me for evidence that he did a DMCA claim when you're putting?" I mean, Molyneux said he was doing it to stop bullying, and you said that he did it to stop bullying. So you obviously know that he did it. And again, is that a war crime? No, it's not. He's just a douche, and he's not as smart as he thinks he is. Okay. Oh man, way behind now. Sorry, guys. Do you think there's a connection between statism and sports obsession? The communists always tried to distract their subjects with sporting events. Well, so in communism, it was a little bit different. So in communism, people's material well-being is really shitty. People don't have toilet paper, people don't have cars, people don't have consumer goods, people don't have enough food, blah, blah, blah. I mean, right, you talk to them, even in the late Soviet Union, when you're past like the starvation periods, you don't have toilet paper, you don't have furniture, you don't have cars, blah, blah, blah. So what is the state? The state has to do something that it can claim, hey, look, this is what we're accomplishing, right? You're enduring all this lack of material goods. So what's the upside here? And there's multiple things they'll point out. And so like the Soviet Union would just point out after World War II, well, we defeated the Nazis, right? This is the number one thing. And then they have these scientific things. Oh, we first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, that kind of stuff. And then the Olympics played a big role in this. Okay, yeah, maybe you don't have all this, but our athletes, they get all these gold medals. Obviously, if we are the best athletes, we are the best in some other sense. And so this is very, very common in communist countries and other countries that are not communist. It's not the case in the United States. I mean, obviously, the United States takes pride in that, but they're not funded by the federal government, I don't believe. They're just we're just super wealthy, so we can afford to have all that kind of stuff. Um, so I don't know that there's this like athletics is a universal thing. Right? We have athletics even with anarchist societies or minimal states or whatever. So I don't think that they're invented by it. But yeah, there's definitely the whole bread and circuses thing. That is a real thing. And we do get a bit of that in the United States. I do, however, think, though, the material well being in the United States is so high that the state does not need to rely on that kind of stuff to get right. Because the Romans, they could always be, they could be facing disease, they could be facing starvation, they could be facing, a military draft, depending on the period that you're talking about. So having that kind of distraction in the life of a early Iron Age person, right, was necessary. It's not necessary now. So I think most of the stuff that we have with sports in the United States is just because we're very affluent. They say the United States is one of the only countries where there's multiple major sports. I mean, there's other countries have multiple sports, but typically soccer is the most popular, and everything else is kind of not that popular. And here we have football's number one, but then basketball, baseball, and hockey are also very, very popular. Hockey regionally so, and then a slew of other sports that are, MMA, soccer, whatever. So yes, the Dave Smith clip was fascinating. I thought it was too. It could also be that he just respects Molyneux and he's friends with him, and so he doesn't want to badmouth him. I don't know, but according to that video, it just didn't sound like he was familiar with all the flaws. Uh, Football is indeed a strategic game where teams set up lines of defense and attempt to create openings in the opponent's defense in order to move the ball down the field. It's highly technical. Yeah, I read that and I know that they do all the plans, but at the end of the day, it just seems like, well, he's faster than that guy, so he got there first, or he's bigger than that guy, so he pushed through. Right? That's definitely what it looks like to a layperson. And I'll admit that that may not be the case, but that's definitely what it seems like. And of course, these guys are all, as much time as they are doing strategy, they're taking steroids and going to the gym and getting as big as possible. And that's another thing he talks about in the book, The King of Sports, the fact that the average size of an NFL player has just ballooned. It's like 40% bigger than it was in the 60s, which is crazy. And yeah, have you ever seen scientific studies on the average NFL IQ? Nope, haven't. I imagine it's not that high. Obviously, there are exceptions, because there's about 1,000 players, so they're not all going to be stupid and whatnot. But I feel like most of them are. Um, Having said that, I find it boring as fuck and have never had an interest in that sport, hockey for life. Yeah, hockey. I don't. Okay, I'm not a huge hockey fan, even though it's in the family, and I have a brother that's deeply involved in the NFL, NHL. But I always thought hockey was more fun to watch, just more engaging, and seemed like it had more skill involved. But again, I know that that's not necessarily true. I think Molyneux might have malignant narcissist. Maybe that is obvious. He reminds me of my narcissist uncle. Yeah, maybe that's why he's so popular. He reminds people of their uncles. Do you think people should complain about being deplatformed on social media if they never bother to try to have the backup site that a lot of their followers could go? Um, they can complain, sure. I do. Look, I'm a pretty strict freedom of association person, and I think that people should always stress that point. It's kind of interesting now. We've had a couple instances where the left will now invoke libertarian talking points to defend its agenda because So we see this with abortion, right? For some reason, the abortion thing is heating up now. I think probably because of Trump and the Supreme Court and all his nominee picks. And the thing is, the pro-choice movement just had abysmally terrible arguments. Basically, just let's pretend it's not a human life and use all these euphemisms for killing a human, right? And I'm not saying that assuming there isn't an argument there. There is, but they just kind of tried to skirt it. Well, we had then this libertarian argument about evictionism, and next thing evictionism 10 years ago with this super esoteric Walter Block, you never even heard of it, in the mainstream, and now it's getting used a lot. Well, the same thing with this deplatforming and this cancel culture, because libertarians, have always supported the freedom of association and the idea that business doesn't have to do business with anybody, right? The fact that you become a company and you start providing a good or a service doesn't make you a slave that obligates you to provide people with stuff. Now, if they're a paying customer, it's true that like most businesses are going to be highly incentivized. The color they're going to see is green, not white or black or whatever else. And I think that's mostly true. And yet people have always argued against that, right? The mainstream argument, and certainly the left-wing argument, is that freedom of association is bad because racism, right? Now, it's kind of interesting. It's almost implied that freedom of association causes racism, which I don't think is true at all. But at the very least, that it would facilitate racism, whereas forced association will not facilitate it. And I don't think that's really true, because if you force association, that does not destroy racism, right? You just embitter a racist in that case. You're not going to make him not racist. Whereas if they are actually doing freedom of association, they're easier to see and there's more you can do about it. Anyway, so now with this deplatforming, suddenly Facebook and Twitter and PayPal and all these they're private companies and they do whatever they want. Well, I support that, but I think that the people who are getting deplatformed should point that out. And they should also point out, to the extent, and this varies from place to place, that government regulations are giving some companies, and again, it's case by case basis. This is true for some and less true for others. But the regulatory capture is kind of putting us in an oligopoly or a monopoly position where one or two firms do have all the market share or nearly all the market share. And that's usually not just because of the free market, but because, in fact, it's almost never because of the free market. It's because of some kind of regulation. And so the things to point out is yes, freedom of association, and no, regulatory capture, right? We shouldn't have rent seeking, and we shouldn't have companies that use the government to engineer like a utility status where they become, um, you know, can't, organizations that can't be competed with. So let's see. Uh, Molyneux says to defoo anyone who isn't an anarcho-capitalist, but somehow fanatically supporting Trump does not contradict this crazy cult idea. Yeah, yeah. I just so his kind of skill, his real skill, is to find a way to do the gymnastics to square the circle and to be contradictory. And also, I think it works because he realizes for most people are not smart enough to kind of follow and see what's going on. Now, a lot of people are smart enough. A lot of his early, like, and this would be an interesting study, but I think if you looked at Molyneux's base, if you looked at the people who followed Molyneux in 2009 or 2006 versus 2016 or now, obviously, there's way more now, and this is a big part of the explanation, but I bet the average IQ has gone way down, right? And again, part of that is just because there's way more people. But, the original people who were going on YouTube and finding Molyneux were really esoteric libertarians who tended to be highly well read and were out there looking for ideas. And he's one of the few content creators. So even if you didn't think he was particularly persuasive, he's one of the few people who was even doing it. And you know what? He has done some really good presentations, right? I've seen him do some really, really good presentations about things like, anarcho-capitalism in terms of like environmentalism. And my favorite video of his was talking about how we shouldn't have a wall and how he ended it by saying walls can keep people in. End of movie. And it was, brilliant. And sure, most of that stuff, all that stuff is derivative, but that's fine. He's delivered it in a really good way. Props to him. But he then got this much wider right-wing appeal, and I trace it to the Zimmerman video that he did, which I do think was a good video by and large. But then Trump even more so, and A lot of those people are not going to be able to follow that kind of stuff, right? He can dance around, and a lot of them aren't even going to know. Right? He's probably got followers now who don't even know that he's an anarcho-capitalist or even what that means. They're just alt-right, and he makes enough videos that are anti-left and sticking it to the libs that they may not know. So, he's very good at that. He's very good at uh, when he can control a debate, right, with a caller. So he doesn't do this when he's got like a guest who has more status than he is, which is another thing. The sycophancy is so awful because when you call him, he treats you like shit, and you're a dog, and you're spanked, and you're whatever. You're all messed up. If you like Lord of the Rings, it's because your mom abused you. I'm not joking. He said that in a video. But then he has, Noam Chomsky on or Tom Woods or whoever else, and he's all deferential and praising them and looking up. So just such a blatant social climber, and we're all guilty of that to some extent or whatever. But if you start like sacrificing principles and character to get it, that's when it starts to become a problem. And he crossed that Rubicon a long time ago. Uh, I don't get Molyneux appeal today, given the smug sociopathic demeanor he gives off, and he always was that way. To be honest, like it was more than a year of me seeing his videos that I decided to finally sub because it was just I didn't like the way that he talked. Now I didn't think that the stuff that I know now, I didn't know that much about him, but he can be really off-putting. But he also can be like hypnotic to a lot of people. There's people who will go and listen to like spend all their time listening to his podcast or whatever. So there's something about some people have that ability, and he does. Now that doesn't work on everybody, but it works on some people. And no, he can deliver a line. Like he produces a lot of content, and a lot of it is decent. A lot of it is good. And he also, because he's coming from this anarcho-capitalist perspective, that he doesn't advertise anymore, but that does give him an angle of insight is unique, right? Your average content creator, these other big names on YouTube, right? Sargon of Akkad or Jordan Peterson or Hunter Avalon or any of these other people, right? They're not anarcho-capitalists. And even though Molyneux doesn't advertise that, he's got that. It's a different perspective, and it's going to come from a different angle, and the fact that it's different in that way, I think, is going to be appealing to some people, even if they're not anarcho-capitalists. Just it's going to be a different way of looking at things. Uh, oh, the way Molyneux treats callers versus the way he treats guests with bigger followings drives me crazy. Yeah, it's just so blatant. He will come and Christianity is evil, Christianity is child abuse, telling your kids you believe in hell. That's evil. They abused you. You should defoo your parents, right? If your parents are Christian, you should defoo your parents. And then, hi, Tom Woods. Oh, it's so great to see you. Well, Tom Woods is a Christian. He believes in hellfire, and he's got 5 children. So Molyneux is, on the one hand, saying that all of Woods's children should defoo him, but then when he's on the show, he's like kissing his ass, and it's just too blatant. And there are a couple times where like Noam Chomsky is probably the best example, but there's several others where you're like, oh, this will be good because you're thinking he's going to be antagonistic, and he's not. He's just suddenly a total sycophant in those situations. Da, 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 da. Do you think it's unlibertarian for libertarians to praise the Black Panthers for standing up for gun rights? Apparently, that's a big controversy. I don't think that's unlibertarian at all. Like, the Black Panthers might be wrong about a lot of stuff, but open carrying of guns for their own defense was totally right. And I mean, I would cite that in a debate readily. There are some people in the gun rights movement who obviously have some racial biases, and who, or not even that, who have pro-government, pro-police biases that make them hesitant to kind of endorse, radically anti-authoritarian gun ownership, whether it's from the Black Panthers or whoever else. But that is a minority. I think most of the gun rights people, and this is not just the libertarian ones, but the NRA and especially the GOA, they want blacks to have guns. They want blacks to open carry. They want black to conceal carry. They have outreach programs for them. They will train them. They want that. All right, and they have wanted that forever. I mean, the NRA's history on this is actually really good. Right? I mean, it goes back to the Civil War. They were arming blacks in the South in the 1870s and 60s, or 1870s and 80s rather, right? So there's a lot of history there that kind of just like the Republican Party, right? They have more credibility and better curriculum vitae here than the Democrats do, because the Democrats have the absolute worst, resume when it comes to that. Uh, uh, duh, duh, duh. While inventing DROs, although I do secretly like Molyneux's book, Practical Anarchy. But that's fine. There's nothing wrong with somebody who takes ideas that have already been expressed and expresses them in a different way that appeals to a different audience. That's wonderful. That's a great achievement. And that's something that he's done on multiple occasions, whether through his videos or maybe through some of his books. But that is not good enough for him. His self image explicitly is one of as the greatest philosopher who's ever lived in all of history. Period. End of sentence. Okay, so being a regurgitator or repackager of classic ideas is not the that is not his aspiration. That's not what he wants to be known for. So he has to advertise much better than that, and it's not good for him. Uh, does Molyneux support violence against me in order to get the wall built? Uh, I think if you asked him that, he would give some shitty answer. I saw one video where he was saying, "Well, look, the truth is the truth, and I'm like the reflection. I'm the shadow of the. If the sun is the truth and the light on the wall is how we know it, then I'm gonna some. Basically, he was saying whatever I'm going to believe whatever the truth is, and the reason and evidence tells me whatever. So without answering, he's just going to say whatever I believe is the truth. It basically is what it came out to. I totally butchered that. Um, let's see. Molyneux is also one of the best philosophers of all time. Plato and Aristotle are complete hacks when compared to the indomitable Molyneux. According to him, I've heard. I mean, he has praised Ayn Rand. I remember once he said, "Well, if I see very far, it's because I'm standing on top of Russian chain smoking giants." But even that is rare nowadays. I think Smith knows. He should know. Smith strikes me as very intelligent and fairly well read, so I think he probably does know, but you never know. I mean, Molyneux isn't famous. Molyneux's books are not well read. I mean, do you think that Smith has read any of Molyneux's books? No. I know he's read Rothbard books and David Stockman and a whole bunch of other people, but has he read Molyneux? Probably not. Because if you're gonna do the top 10 books on libertarianism, if you're gonna do the top 100 books on libertarianism, Molyneux's not going to be on there, right? I don't think that's even remotely contested issue, right? There's so many other contributions that have been out there that are worth more than anything he's ever produced. And again, anything more than I've produced, right? I'm not saying that as a dig. Then I don't go around saying I'm the greatest philosopher in 6,000 years. Uh, who are you voting for in the New Hampshire primary, Sanders or Biden? No, I have to vote for Andrew Yang, obviously. Uh, Baseball used to be number one. Yeah, America's pastime, but I think football passed it in the whenever television started in like the 60s. I'm kind of responsible for that debate between Smith and the head of the Fakertarians. That debate just seemed really stupid to me, and I stopped watching after a while. But why are you responsible for it? What do you think the Democrats are going to do? Do you think they're going to let Sanders get the nomination? Yeah, so this is interesting. I almost thought about if it wasn't Super Bowl day, the video is going to be what's going to happen to the Democratic Party, because it looks like they're splitting in basically in half, where you have all the rhetoric and all the enthusiasm, the logical conclusions of basically everything that they pander to is SJW far left socialism, right? It's Bernie Sanders and AOC. And that's what gets the crowds. That's what gets people motivated. That's what gets people retweeting and posting. And that's what, cancel all your student loans and give you free healthcare and open borders and all this stuff. And yet that, but then Bernie is he's a commie, man. He honeymooned in the Soviet Union there's video of him saying he likes bread lines, that there should only be one type of nylon, there only should be one type of toothpaste. And now with all this Veritas stuff where it seems like his staff is just full of full-on Bolshevik gulag mass murdering communists. So it's like, okay, that guy is not going to win. He's going to get clobbered. That there's going to be a huge, it sounds like there's a huge segment of the Democrats that will either not vote at all or would rather vote for Trump than Bernie. Um, and then vice versa, right? Because then a lot of those Bernie people and AOC people are not going to vote for Pete Buttigieg or Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton, as it turned out. So this is really interesting. It looks like the Democratic Party has this cancer growing on it. This is this socialist SJW part of the party that's sucking all the life from the main party. And the thing is, I mean, it's really disturbing that we have enough socialists in America now that can happen, right? It is bad. It is a sign of the growth of the strength of socialism. But at least in the medium term, there's a chance that this could lead to like Republican victories over and over and over again. Now, it will be Republicans that are taking in tons of moderate Democrats and are probably shitty on every issue just like they are now. So it's a situation kind of analogous to what you have in the UK right now, where the Labour Party is just too far left to win big elections to get majorities. But then the right party, the Tories, are not, they're not very principled libertarian, right? They're just everybody who's not a communist. Unfortunately, the communists aren't going to win, but then that leaves you nowhere. But that is a really interesting question. Uh, do you do you think the rules against transgender people using the bathroom of a gender they identify with will create more problems, or isn't it easier for people to this use the one on the identifier? Look, I don't think that there's a one size fits all answer to that. I do think that this should be a freedom of association question, and you can have gyms, say like Planet Fitness, that say trans whatever you want. All right, so my favorite gym in Wyoming, that's their policy. You can use whatever bathroom you want. All right, if you say I identify as a woman, whatever, you don't have to have a doctor's note, you don't have to have surgery, you can do whatever you want. And apparently there are people that do that there. On the other hand, I could see another place saying, look, listen, we have values that are against this, we have liabilities that are against this, and so no, we're not going to allow it. Or maybe we will allow it, but only under these specific stances. And the idea that like, well, there should be a national policy on this question is just fucking stupid, because that's just 320 million people with different values and different circumstances, and the idea that there's one thing for everybody just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's just one more thing for us to fight about and be bitter over and have a suboptimal solution, right? Because you're going to impose a one size fits all, which ends up being a one size fits almost nobody. And so no, I think that should be left up to private enterprise. And if you say, well, what about public buildings? Then I say, well, we should abolish the public buildings then. This is the same way I feel about education, right? We can argue forever about what curriculum is best, or even if there's such a thing as the best curriculum. You can never answer that question. There is no right answer, because people are different. They have different goals, different proclivities, different agendas. That's never going to happen. And so as soon as you get into this debate, you've lost. It would be better to say, you know what? Don't have public schools. You decide what you want. Uh, Pretty much only like hockey and boxing. Yeah, it's funny though, you would mention those two also probably have CTE, boxing especially. Uh, yeah, IQ people sometimes are like they can be really stupid sometimes. Uh, the problem with the deplatforming argument is it's the free market, so it's stupid. These massive tech giants are not the free market, right? So it depends on which one and all that. But I agree. Like we have to point out that we're in a contrived situation here, a constrained situation, because competition is quite limited to one degree or another, and that needs to be pointed out. But I don't like. But the counter argument then is, well, there is the regulation, and we don't like what they're doing, so now we need more regulation, and we're just putting ourselves on a path towards either direct government control or the more fascistic middle way of government mandated, just kind of running everything, although not necessarily owning it. Bring back Alex Jones. Hoorah, yes. You're one of my favorite thinkers. Would you ever write a book? I've thought a lot about writing a book, but it would not be about libertarianism. I'll give you one guess what it would be about. Uh, this guy in Bitbutter. Oh, thanks. Bitbutter is great. I haven't seen him do a video though in many years, but he made very high quality videos, and he had a very good way of succinctly taking a complex issue and making a 4-minute video about it. Right. So I'm the opposite of that. I like to go on and on and on, but he did wonderful work when he did it. I think he's become too professional to do it. I don't think he's changed his mind. I think he's just like actually doing work. Um, are you familiar with Yan Irving? No. Blah blah blah. So I'm catching up on the social media stuff. Don't think Molyneux applies the peaceful parenting to his own rearing of children. Seems to be too controlling to do that. Isn't there one video where he's bitching about how his daughter was crying and he was trying to save the world philosophically and he couldn't concentrate because she was crying? Something like that. Other than that, I don't think we know enough about his parenting to make statements like that because I certainly don't. Um, I think he's too much of a narcissist to like love his children though. No evidence for that, hearsay, but that's what it seems like to me. Um, you always have the right to complain, but regulation here would just lead to regulatory capture. Yep, that's basically my take. Facebook would just become like a public utility, and that's not what we want. Uh, you said in the past that you used to be an antinatalist. No, I was never an antinatalist. Um, I was a Malthusian. I was definitely a Malthusian when I was like in elementary school, and then I got over it. Uh, have you or would you stream conversation with Brazilian ANCAPs on YouTube? I would have nothing against that. I don't. I only know one Brazilian ANCAP, and I don't know if you would be down to talk. I know him pretty well, but you can guess how I know him. I would have nothing against that, but I honestly I'm not having dialogue with tons of people right now who are asking or seem interested. So, are there any thinkers who advocate a deontological approach to ethics that are not narcissists? Whew. I don't know enough about the thinkers to be able to answer that. Um, I don't think that Michael Huemer is a narcissist, and I don't think the guy who wrote towards a New England libertarianism, he doesn't sound like a narcissist, but I don't know because I don't know them personally that well. Makes me sad that Yang doesn't have a chance. It would be really interesting to see what he could do. Yeah, so he's wrong about this whole universal basic income, but he does seem intellectually honest. He's certainly better on circumcision, but he's not very good on that either, since he's backed that up to just a personal preference instead of taking a really strong stance. But there is a thing here where he has followers who are going to not be happy with anyone other than him, and so you've got these, if it's not Yang, we're not going to vote. Same thing with Bernie. Same thing, maybe. Well, Bernie and him are probably the two. Maybe Tulsi, to a lesser extent. So, and they're cheating him out of like they're like the DNC is blatantly just rigging this again, and it's so blatant that it's going to be bad. It's going to come back to bite them. I'm a Bernie bro. My wife's boyfriend also supports my decision. Tulsi Gabbard is also really hot. I'll take your word for that. Uh, I posted a video of Smith talking about being on Molyneux's show and calling Molyneux a libertarian and Ficatarians. Well, look, I don't have a problem with calling Molyneux a libertarian. I think he is. He's just a shitty person. That's all. Right? There's lots of shitty libertarians. It doesn't really say much about the ideology, though. Da, 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 da. What's a good argument against rent control when rent control is what makes my life easier? Is this a troll comment? No, it doesn't make your life easier. The fact that there's rent control means that there's actually less housing available, which means the price actually does go up, right? If you're for everyone who doesn't have a rent control apartment, and even if you do have a rent control apartment, it means the quality goes down because if they can't raise prices on the rent, then they either have to close or they have to cut corners someplace else, and so they don't fix your water heater or whatever else it is. So no, we need to have supply and demand, and all these zoning and rent control 100% raises housing prices. This has been known. I think this was like well understood even before the Austrian school was founded in the 1870s. Uh, you would write an anti-cert book. No, other issue. My other pet issue. Uh, is it odd that I have a weird fascination with Molyneux, even though I disagree with the majority of what he says? A little bit, yeah. That is a little weird. I think Molyneux is a libertarian when he supports Trump and is very pro-cop. Well, so supporting Trump is kind of like, I mean, there's the famous, is Walter Block also not a libertarian because he famously said, well, if I have to pick between Hillary and Trump, I pick Trump. So that makes him, officially like a Trump supporter, I guess you could say. Same could be said for someone like Scott Horton or Dave Smith or whoever, right? I if I had to pick, I didn't vote, but if I had to pick, I would have picked Trump. I made a video about it with Ivan the Heathen. So there we go. Bingo, visitor. You got it. I'm against antinatalism, but I can't prove that antinatalism is logically inconsistent belief, which is one of the reasons I respect UPB. Being consistent is not enough to make ethics proven. Do you think that it's possible that only a portion of the population is receptive to libertarianism? So there's a qualifier there. I think in a society that's not libertarian, only a certain percentage of the population is going to be receptive to it, right? This is true. Whatever the hegemonic beliefs are, marginal beliefs are only going to have a marginal appeal, right? Because the majority of people, whatever it is, 90% or something like that, um, are not going to accept heterodox ideas that are significantly different from the mainstream in general. There are exceptional cases, but they're the ultimate, the worst, the biggest defeat of libertarianism is like, okay, okay, okay. Doesn't matter how good it sounds. Most people don't believe it, so I don't believe it, right? But then the trick there is if you live in a society that is libertarian, then those people will believe in libertarianism, right? So absolutely normal people, will understand and accept libertarianism when most people are libertarians or whatever. So then the question is, how do you get to that point? It's Yang's intellectual honesty that is what I think would be interesting. I think that the country, yeah, it would just be interesting to have a politician, a presidential politician who is intellectually honest, even if they're wrong, right? Because then you can actually have a discussion of some type, and it can be interesting. Because how can you have a debate when the replies are completely political and completely rhetorical, jujitsu? It's just, I mean, that's whatever, but it's not interesting. I don't know that it would actually be more productive. Uh, bu- 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 Annihilation is easily refuted. We're biologically designed to reproduce. It's completely natural to have kids. Right, John, but and I believe that it's 100%, but that goes into the argument of just assuming because it's natural that it's somehow ethically good, right? So we also are engineered to poop, but that doesn't mean pooping is like a good thing necessarily. Like that's a that's taking an is to an ought, right? So yeah, I agree that we are designed to have kids, but that doesn't prove that it's ethically superior. Uh, yeah, naturalistic fallacy, exactly. Uh, yeah, I do think annihilalists do strike me as misanthropic, and that's really sad. There's a solution that they can partake in, though, right? They don't have to ruin the rest of our days. Um, to answer the question on your shirt, I do not have my foreskin. Carry on. All right, good. You're the first one to answer, so good for you. Good for you, Glenn. Uh, hey, not watching the sports ball final. I honestly did not know the Super Bowl was today. It wasn't until I got to the gym and saw how empty it was that I found out. So no, not watching sports ball. Any topics you are currently reading into? So the book I'm reading right now is The Culture of Critique, which is a critique of Jewish culture. So that is going to be the video that ends this channel, basically. It's a really good book. I think Ivan the Heathen recommended it to me years ago, and I've really liked I'm about halfway through, and I really like it. And I think he's very fair-minded, and it's very interesting, and I think the analysis is quite good. There's obviously a few questions here and there, but quite good. But there's also 100% obviously toxic. Like this is the absolute. It's probably like the most no go that you can go. I would think or close to it. Wait. Someone wants to chemically castrate themselves at 26. Is any organization currently effective at spreading libertarian belief? Well, yeah, I think the Mises Institute. Well, what's effective, right? They're doing it. They're convincing more people. Mises Institute is doing that. Cato is doing that. Reason is doing that. Now, are they doing it a ton? Are they converting millions of people? No, they're not. They are. Are they? They're converting like a trickle of some degree. Um, I think the obviously in my lifetime, the organization that did the most was the Ron Paul presidential campaigns. We don't have anything that's on that order of magnitude right now. Uh, duh, 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 I read that my white nationalist buddies recommended to me. It's a really good book. I don't know why white nationalists would like it because Jews are white as far as I'm concerned, mostly. So at least the Ashkenazi are. But uh, have you read the book How Jews Created Capitalism? No. Has Adam Smith read that book too? Post a review on Buzzsprout. Okay. Well, I might do it on this channel too. I'm not big enough to get like canceled at this point, so it's fine. No, I want to do a vasectomy once I turn 26. Why don't you do it before that? Like, what are you waiting for? Oh, and I guess I should plug that. If those of you who haven't seen, I do have the podcast. There's a couple episodes on there that I've uploaded since the last time I did a YouTube video. So there's stuff on there that hasn't here. Uh, Are you surprised that Free Talk Live is ranked 27th as the highest radio talk show in the country? Well, that's news to me. I didn't realize that it was. I got to say that I guess I'm not. They've consistently grown. I remember when I first started listening to them, they were saying stuff like, over 75 radio stations, and now it's like a couple hundred, right? So that's really good growth for half a decade or however long it's been. And they're very studious. They work at it all the time. They're very ideological, right? They're driven by more than just having a job and being profitable. They're smart guys, and they'll talk about anything. So the fact that they're so open to talk, the fact that I mean, there's a hunger for that, and so yeah, they're anything, and like, I'm not surprised to hear that. I didn't know that was the case, but that doesn't surprise me at all because I don't want my parents to pay for it in Massachusetts. Oh, you don't get it off your parents' insurance until 26. Oh, so it's Obamacare, also known as Romney Care. Why don't you just go to another state and have it done? Just come up to New Hampshire. What book is that? What book are we talking about? Oh, yeah, it sounds like he's afraid to have kids, which I guess I can understand. That's something that could be fear inducing. Holy cow. Oh, no, never mind. Not gonna want kids. Okay, then just don't have any. Do you want to have sex? So do you want to have sex and just not have kids? And that's why you want to get a vasectomy? That makes sense. This is the culture of critique. Kevin McDonald. So just to give you guys a flavor of this, let's read the chapter. Chapter 1, Jews and the Radical Critique of Gentile Culture. Chapter 2, the Bozian School of Anthropology and the Decline of Darwinism in the Social Sciences. Jews in the Left. Jews' involvement in the psychoanalytic movement. The Frankfurt School of Social Research and the pathologization of Gentile group allegiances. The Jewish criticism of Gentile culture, a reprise. Jewish involvement in the shaping of U.S. immigration policy. Conclusion: Whether Judaism and the West. So, gives you some idea of the chapters there, but they're quite good. The Jews in the Left was good. The Jews in Darwinism was good. The Jews in the Left was a really good chapter, actually. And I'm currently on the Jewish involvement in the psychoanalytic movement. Want to have sex, doesn't want to have kids. What if you change your mind? I believe can't isn't it possible to get an unvasectomy? Although I think there's like a high probability it doesn't work. I do think it's very lame and pathetic how some white nationalists blame everything. Yeah, this is the inverse of the reparationist blacks, or rather the white liberals on the behalf of blacks, saying that all your problems are because of slavery, and it's demotivating. And even if it's self-defeating in the sense that even if it's true, like even if you want to say that slavery has a negative effect, well, you can't undo the history of slavery. So what are you going to do to fix it? I mean, that's ultimately what you have to do. And that's the same with the white nationalists. Look, Jews exist. There are powerful, influential Jews that are out there. I think the idea that they are secretly conspiring with all of each other as a group Jews is ridiculous. Are there subgroups of Jews? Sure. I mean, AIPAC is a real thing. The state of Israel is a real thing, although even there's disagreements and differences that exist, right? There are organizations that are primarily or exclusively Jew, or B'nai B'ref or the ADL, right? But they're not all connected. Not all Jews think the same thing, anything like that. That's like just silly. But let's just say even if it was true, bitching about it all the time, it's not going to do anything, right? You need to get your fucking life together. Jewish involvement in the libertarian movement. Bum, bum, bum. It's very true. What thoughts on fringe elements hypothesis that libertarian psychology profile was created in the Middle Ages and didn't exist prior? Well, I haven't thought about it too much. I don't know if there's enough evidence because I believe this is that they were executing people who basically committed crimes. So they were executing non-libertarians, whereas people who were more successful with like business or whatever were propagating more. The thing is, I don't know if that was unique to that society to executing people. The other thing is, we definitely have libertarian like rhetoric and writing and philosophy that goes back way before that, right? So there's a lot of libertarianism in stuff like Aristotle and Hesiod and a couple others. Uh, um, uh, uh, some of the Cicero, Tacitus, Polybius, right? So now those are thinkers and writers, and you could say, well, that wasn't the whole society, and maybe not, but how are you measuring that? Um, so is it wrong? Is it impossible? No, I wouldn't say that, but I don't know that it's like if he's calling it a hypothesis, then he's right. It's a hypothesis. It is not something that's been proven at this point. Um, this is the big debate. Um, there's a big debate as to why the Industrial Revolution happened. And if you read Deidre McCloskey, who I think has the best work on this, so she has the trilogy, the Bourgeoisie Dignity, Bourgeoisie Virtue, and Bourgeoisie Equality, I think. Um, Something was going on ideologically in the Netherlands and a little bit later in the UK, where basically a kind of libertarianism took root in general society, and the idea was that you are not obligated to everybody else in nearly the same way that historically people were. One of the big problems that they have in Africa right now is that if you get ahead, if you do well, right, you're a good farmer or whatever, a good business person, you have all your family and all these kin groups who feel entitled to the fruits of your labor to an equal measure to you, right? If you do well, you need to share with them. And of course, you should have the right to do that if you want. But the social pressure to do that is so great that what ends up happening is you get no accumulations of capital, which means you don't get really any entrepreneurship, which means you kind of stagnate. And the thing is, that is not something that is unique to Africa. That's very common historically. There's also this idea that like you have a place, you have a certain place. Your place is to be a serf. Your place might be to be a merchant, but not more than that, or to be a nobility, or to be in the clergy or whatnot. And that lack of mobility, that lack of autonomy, is really stifling for the economy. You want people to be able to follow their own muse and develop their own skills and find a niche that they're the most interested in, and that's going to be incentivized to be a lot more productive. So why that happened, really good question. Gary North has talked about this a lot. Not that he's necessarily the most reputable source for many people, but he claims, and he's biased here, but it's a theological change, right? If you look at the sermons that were being delivered in the Netherlands after the iconoclasm, after the breakup with the Spanish Empire, there was this kind of a part of their religious belief was that you should have more autonomy and whatnot. So hotly debated, but I think the evidence that it's genetic versus an ideological shift isn't very good. I think that the better evidence is for an ideological shift, but it could be both, right? And those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive ideas either. So interesting idea, yet to be proven. McCloskey's ideas haven't been proven either, but I think that she is I mean, her books are very good, and I think that they say a lot on that issue. Should a user be banned? No. Hey, I know this is random, but I read the book Teen 2.0, the book you talked about, and it's a very good book. It is a very good book. If you are watching this and you've not read it, read Teen 2.0. Newt Gingrich approved. Uh, I'm not gonna lie, I've been working on YouTube for a decade, and I like you and your work a lot. Would you be willing to debate me since I'm more on the left? Please. I don't know, debate you on what? I really need the help. You need the help about what? Duh, duh, duh. Don't ban usury. Yeah, but the whole point of usury is it's arbitrary what that is. There are certain things where a very high interest rate is warranted, right? And what that is so context and market dependent that the idea that we can just ban it just doesn't make a lot of sense. This is like saying that high risk should be banned. Says who? Says what? For what? Like there are times when high risk shouldn't be banned. So I think that there was a lot. Look, there's a lot of debt forgiveness is a common form of pandering that's been done. States have done it, like debt absolution has been a common occurrence throughout history. The Babylonians used to do it all the time. The Romans did it a couple times. And I really feel like the Catholic Church was kind of getting on that. Oh, we're going to ban high interest loan. They didn't know enough about economics to know how that could be bad. Uh, Should women have the right to vote? I don't think anyone has the right to vote. Like I don't believe in democracy, so like the argument that women should have the right to vote is a good one. We're getting taxed. We have to follow all these laws, so we should have a say. Fair enough. But then I wish then people could just opt out and be like, well, how about I don't pay taxes and then I don't vote. And I would take that, but that's not an option that we're given, sadly. Uh, the schism post 2012 of libertarianism was the leftist please give me have liberty versus right wing don't trespass or else. That is beginning for freedom versus sovereignty thoughts. Well, I don't know that there's a well-defined binary schism in libertarianism, right? Libertarianism had this relatively explosive growth with the two Ron Paul campaigns, and it brought in a lot of people, but it brought in a lot of different kinds of people than had been there before. And many of those people are still around, right? We still have Dave Smith, for instance, as an example. But some of those people have since left, and they seem to have split in different ways. Some of them have become alt-right, some of them have become left, right? I know a lot of people who are woke Bernie bros now who voted for Ron Paul, right? I had friends who voted for Ron Paul twice who are Bernie bros now. I have other friends who became fucking white nationalists. So I don't, but and then you have the people who didn't change. So that's not a one-way split. That's at least a three-way split. Um, I do agree that those two sentiments are kind of mutually exclusive sentiments, and they do typify most libertarians, right? So they're all the people, hey, I want to be free, please give it to me, chill out, man. And then you have the other people who are like, I already have my rights, motherfucker. Don't take them away. Uh, Women can vote and shareholder elections. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Women should be able to vote in shareholder elections. It's kind of funny that banning of usury led the money lending industry to be dominated by Jews. And then the Jews get blamed for being greedy. Yeah. If you ever read Bart Ehrman's stuff on early Christianity, and ever since I heard him on um, Sam Harris 2 years ago, I've read one of his books and I've listened to probably 20 hours of his lectures. And he talks about, it's very, very interesting going into the history and the analytics of the New Testament. But he talks a lot about you have the religion of Jesus, but Christianity is not that. Christianity is the religion about Jesus. So you have what we can tell, and it's hard to tell for sure, but there's good indicators based on the cross-examination of the various books of the Bible on the original texts. There are some ideas we have about what Jesus, and he falls into the camp of thinking Jesus was a real person, and I think that the best evidence is that Jesus probably was a real person, um, if not necessarily a divine person, but a real person. And he had teachings. But then after his death and within a century of his death, the church was changing in a way to become a religion that was about Jesus himself, right? Instead of taking his teaching per se, it was more about deifying this guy. This Christology developed, and basically for the next 400 years, there was an ever increasing Christology where first he's a prophet, and then he becomes like some kind of quasi angelic being. Then he becomes like co-equal with God, and then he becomes God himself, but a different aspect of God that is equal but different, and right? And then they get into these super weird and but anyway, one of the changes, this whole tangent here, one of the changes from the original teachings, as far as we can tell, and it has to be emphasized that we don't have original writings of Jesus. They likely weren't any original writings of Jesus. Yeah, there's we know from what we have that there is some skipped steps because Jesus would have been speaking Aramaic. The earliest texts we have are in Greek. The original apostles probably were illiterate and probably didn't speak Greek. It's like the second generation people who would have spoken Greek, so they're getting this stuff not firsthand, but maybe probably not even secondhand, but a couple ways down, and with the translation and blah blah blah. But the religion about Jesus also became distinctly more anti-Semitic because the original teachings of Jesus, as far as we can tell, were not anti-Semitic. Now, and we can debate about what anti-Semitism means, but the idea of the Jews are the Christ killers. The Jews are responsible for killing Jesus, even though the Romans aren't, but the Romans are the ones who literally killed him. So, Pilate gets off, but Caiaphas doesn't. Interesting stuff. If anyone who's interested, I highly recommend listening or reading any of Bart Ehrman's books. Uh, bu- 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 So if not democracy, what would be the best alternative political system? Well, the more minarchist the political system, the better. The more natural rights, the more restrictions on the government, the better, right? And whether that's best served by a monarchy or a republic or whatever else, very debatable. Um, there are arguments that monarchy might be able to make this might be the best. There are arguments that republics might be the best. Democracies are just too uh, everything is too negotiable, and you get this incentive for the state to grow in power. So that now, of course, my preferred option is anarcho-capitalism, where markets and capitalism are basically the mechanism by which the needs of the people are satisfied, because I don't think that there's a strong argument that you have to have a state to provide them. Not only that you don't have to have a state, that the state's the optimal of the alternatives, right? There's two criticisms of anarchism. One is that it just can't exist, right? It's impossible, which is clearly false. Or the more nuanced and harder argument to make, but less rhetorically simple, is that yes, anarchism could work, but states are optimal. They work better than anarchism would, depending on what issue it is, right? And so the classical liberal kind of mix on this is that for most things, markets are better. For a few things, military, maybe laws, it depends who you ask, maybe roads or whatever. Um, States are better, however organized, and but then that becomes a debate: is that really which one is optimal and suboptimal? As soon as you start getting into that discussion, though, I think that there's a lot of doubt that it gets cast onto states that is otherwise just kind of assumed to be there. What the fuck did I stumble upon? What is this? I don't know. What is the author? Bart Ehrman. If anyone knows who that is, can they type it? I think one of his books is titled How Jesus Became God. So if you want to look up the book How Jesus Became God by Bart Ehrman, I highly recommend that book. Very interesting book, just going into the Christology of early Christianity in the New Testament. So yeah, Bart Ehrman and How Jesus Became God. He has a couple other books too that are really good. There we go, Bart Ehrman. Um, a system where the only way to fund things on credit is through vendor financing and equity isn't going to eliminate wealth inequalities. I don't know why eliminating wealth inequalities is a metric by which we should organize society. Duh, duh, duh. Are you going to Porkfest this year? It depends if I work or not. I always love to go to Porkfest if I can, but the last several years I've had to work. This year, at the last minute, I was able to go, but I don't know about this year. I will go if I can, though. American Christianity is a religion of the Old Testament and is driven by money and xenophobia and has nothing to do with Jesus in reality. Well, I don't agree with that characterization about driven by money and xenophobia. I do agree that the connection to Jesus is limited. This is true both of classical Christianity and then even more true with American Christianity, which American Christianity is different. No, American Christianity is very diverse, right? So there are certain parts of it that are going to be more or less different, but there definitely has been an American twist to Christianity, which has become important because it's become an ever increasing part of Christendom. Going to Porkfest for the first time from Massachusetts. Well, it depends. Are you staying in a hotel? Are you staying on the campground? Are you camping? Are you in a tent? That's going to be the most salient thing about, your creature comforts. But you should expect a lot of guns. You should expect a lot of drugs. You should expect a lot of lectures that will vary in interest. And some of them will be very interesting, and some of them will not be. There'll be a lot of people there. There'll be lots of people to meet. You'll make lots of new friends. You'll see a lot of people that you've probably seen online or heard about, but never had a chance to meet. So there's kind of that element going on. There's very beautiful scenery. It's about 20 or 30 miles away from the presidential range, but the view is spectacular. So you can see Mount Washington, Mount Adams, Mount Jefferson, and Eisenhower. On a clear day, you can actually see the weather station on top of Mount Washington. Um, so China versus USA, a Thucydides trap or not? What's a Thucydides trap? Uh, duh, duh, duh. After listening to the history of the Mormons, I would love to learn about the history of Christianity. Thanks for the reference. Yeah, so especially if you're a neophyte, I would definitely recommend people read Bart Ehrman stuff or just listen to his interview on Sam Harris is a good place to start. But he actually has many, many, many hours of lectures available online for free on YouTube, so you can spend the rest of the night, all week, listening to Bart Ehrman, and I recommend it. And I actually listened some of his books and are an audiobook on YouTube for free. So I think I listened to how Jesus became Christian on YouTube. It's about a 10-hour book if you listen to it. Hotel nearby, but none of my in real life friends are libertarians, so I'll be by myself. You will start off by yourself, but you'll meet people, right? Be friendly. There's lots of places to congregate around dinner tables, food tables, campfires. Um, Strike up a conversation. That's one of the main things that goes on there. Um, yeah. I saw mushrooms at Porkfest last year. They were so expensive. You finally found them. People were looking forever. Um, you always find people looking like, hey, where's the whatever? Where's the Molly or where's the this or where's the that? And they go on a quest to find it. I want to see Sam Harris and Thaddeus Russell debate. What would they debate though? The end game for China is a total domination. The ultimate goal is every Chinese family to have a white butler. I don't think that's true. I think the Chinese, they're it appears to be that they're highly influenced by the sick man of Asia syndrome of the 19th century and the early 20th century, the unfair treaties, all that kind of stuff. They were humiliated. You had this society that for thousands of years, rightly or wrongly, considered itself the most advanced, the most glorious, the most civilized country in the world, right? The most technologically advanced, the richest, the most just, the most, they just, they're, every society is kind of chauvinistic in that way. And China definitely was at least as much as everybody else, maybe more. And unlike everybody else, they had a better claim to it, right? That society has just traditionally been very wealthy and very advanced and whatever. I mean, you can point out all these flaws, but relative to everybody else, they did pretty well, at least in terms of material being. Um, and then there's this horrible, horrible shock of the European dominated world. And the Europeans were just obviously vastly technologically superior, economically superior, politically superior, scientifically superior, religiously superior, right? So it's not like Confucian religions are sneaking and spreading in the West or in Africa. It's Christianity that's spreading through China to one degree or another. And this has been a profound influence on the culture and the politics of China. So I think what they don't want to take over the world. They want to become a regional hegemon, which is, I mean, because of their population and because of where they are and their size, I mean, it just makes sense that they would be that. And they want to be safe from that ever happening again. I think they want to be in a position where they won't have treaties imposed on them, where they won't be a second rate power. They have great power aspirations. They don't have world domination aspirations. And historically, it's kind of a joke to talk about the Chinese taking over the world, right? They got taken over by the fucking Mongols, for Christ's sake. So, and the Russians and everybody else. So, no, I don't think that they have world domination plans. Uh, One state rising in a world dominated by another, i.e., Athens and Sparta, England and Germany, leads to a war, usually a total war. Is China the Germany of 1913? Uh, I don't think so because I don't think either one is an existential threat to the other one, other than the idea of mutually assured destruction with nukes. So there's not going to be a situation where China could, suddenly invade and conquer Eurasia, for instance, right? They'll never have that kind of power. They're surrounded by too many other states that are too powerful for them to do that or to conquer South America or North America or anything like that. Right? They're hemmed in by geography and politics and technology, and the same vice versa. So they don't pose existential threats. The difference here was, say, Spartan or Athens could destroy each other. Germany could maybe not destroy the British Empire right away, but they could take over continental Europe and put Britain in a horrible position, in an untenable position. And I don't think that the United States and China are capable of doing that to each other. Also, and this doesn't prove that they can't go to war. People say when you know uh, goods will cross borders or armies will. well, that there's some salience to that, but it's not a law. But it's also true that we do a lot of business with them and vice versa, and it wouldn't be in either of our interests for that to end in a cataclysmic war. But yeah, so I don't think it's the Thucydides trap. That that said, I do not trust the nationalistic military industrial complex of the United States, right? They are nationalists. They want to go to war for all kinds of bad reasons, right? Financial incentive reasons and ego reasons and whatnot. They look at it like a game and they see their rival as China. It's been Russia and China for a long time. Russia is just like a joke, is becoming an increasing joke. Um, China is has advanced a lot recently, but there's serious questions of whether that rate of change will continue. It has serious demographic problems. Um, coronavirus, independent of that. Um, and it's I could see them doing something really stupid. I mean, they've done something really stupid in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and they could do something really stupid again. So that's kind of my big fear. I don't think Beijing, though, is going to they're going to invade South Korea, they're going to invade Russia, they're going to invade India, they're going to invade Southeast Asia. I think all that's very unlikely. Oh, striking up a convo at Porkfest can be challenging for an introvert, but they do. Yep, there's a lot of people at Porkfest who are on the spectrum, and yet they manage to do it. When was the last time Malamine was at Porkfest? I saw him there in 2012 or 2013. That's when I made my first video about Molyneux. I think if you just look, it's just titled Stefan Molyneux. It's a video of me sitting in a truck in a forest, actually, but I think that's the last time he went. I don't think he's been there since then. What's your take on Ted Kaczynski's The Unabomber? I haven't read his thing, so I wouldn't want to really talk about it. Uh, but I think Molyneux was banned from Porkfest. He was getting too much libertarian poo-tang. Young hot girls are naturally drawn to an alpha male at these type of events. Is that a joke? That sounds like trolling. First of all, Porkfest would never ban anybody for getting too much poo-tang. So yes, that's a troll. That's a troll comment. I'm calling it out. Uh, is the U.S. commitment to the Middle East worth the benefits? No, that's a categorical no. Absolutely not. Um, how much are people here prepping for Corona? I'm ready. Uh, yeah, I saw the video. You were in your car. Yep. I no longer that car is totaled, but that was my car for many years. Molyneux's documentary about Poland was a 1 hour video about himself. Yeah, I didn't watch that. Do you believe the Middle East will become secular again? When was the last time the Middle East was secular? Duh. Yeah, my vibe on the corona is like it's the flu again. I mean, I could be wrong, but I tend to think it's not going to be as bad as people fear. Uh, how many houses do you own? None. Zero. Will there be speakers at Porkfest talking about Bitcoin? So I'm going to assume yes. Bitcoin was ever like when you went in 2012, 2013, Bitcoin was just the thing, man. Almost all the speakers were about it. People were debating it all the time. It was awesome. And I made thousands of dollars because I bought 10 Bitcoin for $100 total at the time. But it's less so now because Bitcoin's just been around for 10 years and it's whatever. There'll still probably be speakers who talk about it. You'll definitely be able to use Bitcoin there. It's one of the few places you can go and use crypto to buy stuff. You definitely can use your Bitcoin there, and you can definitely buy Bitcoin there. And you can buy it with pretty much anything. If you want to bring cash, you want to bring silver, whatever, you can buy it there. Bring a gun, they'll buy your gun with Bitcoin. So, duh, 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 duh. Who would be a better masters of the Middle East? The Saudis, the Turks, Iran? Maybe be the only way to pacify the region. It's a good question. Um, I don't think any of them can be a hegemon over the whole region because of the cultural differences. There aren't enough Shiites and there aren't enough Sunnis. So the Sunnis are never going to rule Persia in any long-term way, and the Persians are never going to rule the southern half of the Gulf or the Arabian Peninsula. So, or at least not anytime soon. You have to have major demographic shifts. And the Turks, I think they're too far north for that to really affect them. So, um, I think that there needs to be some kind of balance that's going to be worked out between them. And I don't think the United States has been destabilizing to all of this. There's always this argument that if you have a big hegemon, they can somehow make it stable. And whether that's even hypothetically true, I think is debatable, but it's certainly not the case with the United States. I mean, we've yo-yoed and oscillated between supporting the Sunnis and supporting the Shiites over and over and over again. We were supporting Persia. Then they had overthrew the Shah, so we supported Iraq to fight the Persians. And then we supported the other Sunnis in their war against Saddam in the first Gulf War. Then we supported the Shia, well, we secretly supported the Shiites with Iran-Contra. And then 9/11 happened, and we go to war against the basically the Deobandi Taliban, which is not a Middle Eastern, right? That's not part of the Persian Gulf, really. They're Muslims, but it's a different sect. But that was to the advantage of Iran because they did not get along with the Taliban either. But then it gets really fucked up with Iraq War II because now we're overthrowing a secular, more or less secular Baathist Shiite or Sunni dictator and basically awarding the supermajority of the population, the Shiites, Iraq. So suddenly now Baghdad is the Shiite city, which it hasn't been for like 1,000 years. And now Shiistan is, politically includes Iraq now at this point, or most of Iraq, not the northern or the western parts of it. So this pissed off the Saudis, and so we had to placate them by subsidizing the rise, well, by trying to oust Assad, by subsidizing ISIS, and it's just been a huge mess. I think if we were to walk out of it, we'd still have a problem with Israel because Israel's going to be jumping in there between the two. But I think we should just wipe our hands and let them balance it out themselves because we don't have the ultimate things that are determining like the balance of power here are the demographics and the economics. And we are not going to stay there long enough, right? We're not going to stay there long enough for the Shiites to outbreed the Sunnis or vice versa, or for one of the groups to westernize and become de-religious. Or I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's the time scales that we're talking about for there to be a serious shift in policy. So I think we should wipe our hands, so we can stop having 9/11s happen because of it. Because that is definitely, I mean, that was the number one reason that fucking Osama gave. So, uh, bu- 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 who's your favorite thinker author? I'm going to be cliche and say Rothbard, but also Michael Huemer, Deidre McCloskey, if we're talking about contemporary people. Um, let's see. I mean, I've read a lot of Thomas Sowell, to be honest. He's consistently writes really good stuff. Um, who's another one that I read a lot of? Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't go beyond that. I mean, let's see. I'm gonna go to the Alt Expo if I go to PorcFest. Well, Alt Expo is sometimes fun, but it's usually not my gig. Corona, swine flu. Yeah, everyone talks about the Spanish influenza, and it's like, yeah, but our ability to deal with this is so astronomically better than it was in 1920 that it's just that much more difficult. I mean, look, virology and bacteria, they're becoming more advanced, right? They're developing, but we're developing too, and we're developing, I think, faster than they are technologically. And so we can just handle this stuff way better than they could. Uh, if you could recommend 5 intro to libertarian books that I could give to my Bernie bro friends, what would the books be? Well, I don't know that that would really work, but if I was going to pick, I would say The Problem with Political Authority by Michael Huemer, Libertarianism Today by Jacob Hubert. How about The Triumph of Conservatism by Gabriel Kulko, Power and Market by Rothbard, and what would be another really good one? Hmm. So again, Problem of the Political Authority by Michael Huemer, Power and Market by Rothbard, Triumph of Conservatism by Kulko, Libertarianism Today by Jacob Hubert. And let's go with, for number five, I don't know, what do you people think? Um, I mean, I haven't read it, but probably just, if they're Bernie bro, just go with like Tom Woods's book, like, because he wrote one about Bernie, why your Facebook friends are on about Bernie or something like that. Yeah, I would just go with that because it's geared toward that audience. Um, mm, is it bad that I want oil prices to drop so that Dave can keep pumping out more content without going back to work? Loving the podcast. Oh, thank you. If you listen to the podcast, please comment. It is getting listens, just not a ton at this point. I am curious who's listening to it. Also, comment how you're listening to it, like what venue you are using. And also, that's terrible that you wish I don't make money. Puntain Guns, Bitcoin, best pork fest ever. Yeah, touche. Do 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 do. Oh man, I'm way behind, guys. Sorry. You read Max Stirner? No, never read Max Stirner. He used to be quite popular in like 2006, 2007 on the libertarian YouTubers, but I never got around to reading them. Uh, bu- 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 Who would Rothbard vote for in 2020 at gunpoint? I honestly think he would vote for Trump, to be honest. They're both New Yorkers, and he would probably find some inconsistent way to support him. Duh, duh, duh. I read the first chapter of Kaczynski's manifesto, and it was something about over socialization of the West, and it made sense to my 19-year-old mind. Well, he was apparently quite brilliant, right? So there's no, so he probably said something cogent. Any anti-vaxxers in the house? Well, I'm anti-mandatory vaxes, but I'm not an anti-vaxxer in that sense. You don't think that the Bernie Bros have already read Triumph of Conservatism by a Marxist historian? Well, he's a neo-Marxist historian, as best as I can tell, and no, I don't think that they have. I think that those insights of Kolko and both his book, well, Railroads and Regulations is another really good book of his that I just read this summer, but Triumph of Conservatism I think is better. And it's interesting because the conclusions in that book and the thesis of that book is identical to Butler Schaefer's book, Boundaries of Order and In Restraint of Trade. And he's an anarcho-capitalist libertarian, right? They have the exact same take, basically. But no, I don't think leftists read those books. I think that when leftist thinkers have insights without leftist conclusions, they just get ignored by the majority of leftists and by the majority, and their rhetoric doesn't make it in. So the idea that regulatory capture is a thing and that corporations primarily are buoyed by the government, by regulations of the state, is an insight that I don't know anyone on the left has. I just don't know that. I've never heard any hint from a leftist that they understand that, even though it is actually not difficult to grasp and fairly obvious if you think about it for 10 seconds. Ayn Rand. I would not recommend any of Ayn Rand's books if I only had to pick five, and that's no dig on her. The podcast is free. I don't charge anything. There's no paywalls. You can listen to everything for free. Uh, how will libertarianism deal with automation? Well, we already lost most of our jobs, right? Most of the jobs that existed in 1900 are gone, right? So I think that is, look, automation makes it cheaper to make things, so then there's more money to be spent other places, and there's more demand. Your money goes further, so you can be paid less and get the same amount of stuff because everything's being built by robots instead of by expensive humans. So I think that this is just a classic case of fear mongering that's been going on for 200 years almost. And I understand that you could make the argument that this time it's different because AI, blah, blah, blah. And my retort to that is, well, we've always had the ability to create AIs by having children, right? Children are going to be born, and the children are someday going to be in the workforce. And does that mean that the non-children, right, the adults, are all going to become unemployed? And the answer is no. And you say, well, AI is a little bit different, and it is because it can reproduce much more. And at some point, in some ways, it's going to be smarter than our children, or maybe even vastly smarter. And that just means that we're going to have a much richer society, in my estimation. I'm liking the podcast, ashamed of the halftime show. I'm from Miami. It depicted this town in a nutshell. Okay. Good evening, Ron. I'm sure everyone is busy watching the game. Yeah, watch. The number of people watching just like quintuples because it's halftime. Um, Butler Schaefer's book is an extension of The Triumph of Conservatism to me, and I think Triumph of Conservatism came out first, and it would be very unlikely that Butler hadn't read that. And so it seems like he is basically rewriting the book from a libertarian perspective. Um, if you want something that's a little bit more original Schaefer, then I would recommend Boundaries of Order, which is really quite good. It's although I think that also is very similar to the Territorial Imperative, just also through a libertarian lens, but I recommend them both. There's also, yeah, well, I was going to say In Restraint of Trade, but that's the book. But I think Kolko's is the best, and also because it's coming from a leftist, it carries that much more weight. It's called the Lengthy Unearthed Podcast, and if you look, I think at the last video before this one or the one before that, I put the link in the description. So if you look at some of my videos, there are links in the description to that. It should be on iTunes though. I checked and I found it. So just type my YouTube name into like iTunes and you should be able to find it. Is Roderick Long an ANCAP? I believe that he is. He defines himself as a left libertarian, but I believe he is also an anarchist and he believes in markets, right? He's one of those types who doesn't like to, there's some libertarians would say they're pro-business, and he would not say that. He takes it more, oh, he's for unions and labor, but he believes in freedom of association, so it's kind of a um, potato, potato, half full, half empty, I think, to a large extent. Also, his essay on how government fixed the healthcare problem is one of the best essays, probably the best essay I've ever read uh, on why healthcare is so expensive. So, how government fixed healthcare by Roderick Long is one of the best things that you can, if you're going to get into a debate or you want to help yourself understand that better, I would highly recommend that essay. He also got fucked up by the IRS at some point. They like took all of his money, and I don't know how that ever turned out. Coco didn't like the libertarians liked his book. I'm sure he didn't, but whatever. Um, can you repeat the last book? The Triumph of Conservatism by Gabriel Kolko. Also, Boundaries of Order by Butler Schaefer, and In Restraint of Trade, also by Butler Schaefer. And then the article by Roderick T. Long is, I think it's titled How Government Fixed the Healthcare Crisis or something like that. But if you just type Roderick Long and How Government Fixed Healthcare, you'll find it. Um, Also about the podcast, any direction on every other podcast being about your dream and cat society? Wait, no, I don't now understand the question, Mohammed. Um, is this a podcast? No. So this is a YouTube channel. This is not going to be part of the podcast, but I have a separate parallel podcast. I did that just so that if YouTube fucking deletes my channel, I have a backup, not of everything, but of just a forum. So that's kind of it. And also, it's it's like it's almost as long as I've had the YouTube channel, people have been bugging me to do a podcast, so I finally decided to do it. So it's still new. I'm still working out how I want it to work, but I'm trying to put up at least one a week, maybe two a week on there. So it's all free. You don't have to pay. There's no ads or anything. So, go at it and share it if you like it. Do, do, do. Would corporations and fractional reserve bank would corporations and fractional reserve banking and Capstan? So I think corporations would. There are some people, and there's actually a good debate here that limited liability is a form of subsidy given to corporations, and that without limited liability, corporations could not exist. And I remember there's a fascinating debate with Harry Brown where somebody so Harry Brown was not an anarchist, and I believe this was the main reason is he thought to have corporations you had to have limited liability, and without it they couldn't exist. As to fractional reserve banking, you know, as much as libertarians hate fractional reserve banking, Rothbard at all, I actually don't think that it's ethically wrong if you are open about it. If you say, while we are loaning, well, like we don't have full reserves, we have a rotation of reserves, and there's the potential that your money may not be here, then they're not committing fraud, right? You're taking a risk. You're putting your money into a bank that's going to lend it out at interest to pay you interest, and then there's a chance that those loans could go bad and you could lose money. So the ethical argument against fractional reserve banking from the point of view of libertarians was that it was fraud. But if they tell you that they're doing that, then it's not fraud. And so I tend to think that fractional reserve banking would exist, and it could exist. Now, if you don't have a central bank and you don't have fiat currency, um, then there's limits to how much they can inflate. And also, if there's open competition in money, which I think most libertarians ultimately would agree with, right? So you have some libertarians who'll say gold standard or silver standard or Bitcoin or whatever. But I think the better view and the more common single view is that there should just be competition in money, and you would see that there would be competing currencies. And I would be very fascinated to see what would win out. My hunch is that there would be a bimetallic system of gold and silver, but that there could be fractional reserves based off of that to within limits, and not like government limits, but within market limits, right? And that's my guess. But you could also have, I mean, George Selgin has done a lot of work on this, on the idea of free banking, but that's basically my take. I don't think fractional reserve ranking is ethically wrong if they are open with the fraud, right? If they're or it's not fraud if they tell you what they're doing. They just typically don't, right? Most people don't think that's what's happening. They think that their money's in their bank and that's it. And it's insured by the federal government, and that's moral hazard, and FDIC is a huge problem and whatever. But duh, 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 duh. I distinctly remember hearing Coco say once that the difference between fascism and communism is over. Tell that to Bernie. Would it make sense for a really poor person to become a libertarian, or are they better off supporting Bernie? No, libertarianism is definitely better for the poor. All of the marginal changes that libertarianism would propose, all the deregulation and the detaxes, that's going to have the biggest, most salient effect on the poor. It'll be easier for them to find work. It will be easier for them to make money. It will be easier for them to have economic mobility. Regulations ossify things. Regulations protect established firms, established wealth, established companies to the detriment of startups and young people and that sort of thing. So, yes, I think that it would definitely help the poor. And also, in an existential way, um, communism, socialism, handouts, that kind of stuff, I think is really debilitating in terms of people's character. And saying, hey, you're free and you're responsible and you have autonomy. That's a little bit scary, and there are problems that can come with that. But ultimately, that is the path to having a good life, not having a handout from Bernie. Uh, there's no reason fractional reserve banking couldn't exist in Ancapistan. I agree. Although if there's hard money, 100% reserve rate, they would have competition. Yes, that's exactly it. So uh, someone offers you, hey, I have these notes that are a promise to pay you in gold. And so that from a fractional reserve bank, they have gold reserves, but they've loaned out more money than they have, or they printed more of these notes. Will you accept them? And you might, but if you could also accept gold, you would be like, okay, well, I would rather have gold than these. Um, and but you might still accept them, but you might accept them at a discount. Be like, okay, well, if you're going to pay me paper that's a receipt for gold, but not the actual gold, sure, I'll accept it, but I want 10% more or whatever. And that's what happened in the 19th century. Um, Banknotes got discounted based on how much people were willing to believe that they were backed up by something. And the really good banks with really good reputations, I think that they got spot. Um, so and then the really bad ones got, and of course, really bad ones here included the governments at certain times, especially the Confederate government. So, no, there's no reason they couldn't exist. I think that they would exist, but if you were an employee or an employer, I mean, if you were an employer or for your company and you get paid, would you rather get paid in a depreciating currency that becomes more valuable, that's guaranteed, or a currency that is more fragile? Well, probably you prefer the first one. You might still accept the second one, but you'd probably want to accept it at a discount. The minarchist YouTuber Sticks and Hammer is looking for an ANCAP to debate him. Would you consider doing that? Sure, I'd consider doing that. He even lives in Vermont, which is next door. Um, oh, I meant for your non-YouTube podcast, could you throw up an ANCAP state system from the ground up, not every week, but maybe every month? Yeah, sure. I've been thinking about doing that. So that sounds like a good idea. That's something I would be willing to do. Um, does fractional reserve banking create expansion and contraction of the money supply, which screw with exchange rates and create depressions? Ooh. So, well, it can create expansions and contractions, but so can gold, right? If you mine more gold, if they start bringing, if we have a gold standard and like Tesla brings back an asteroid that's got 100 trillion tons of gold on it, we're going to have monetary expansion. So, like, there's nothing that makes that impossible. Depends on the definition of the depression, but yes, if you have an expansion that's based on nothing and people realize that their investments are wrong, there will be, a well, I think the better way to call it is a correction or a reallocation where people realize, hey, these various enterprises, whether they be loans or corporations or whatever, they made sense at this interest rate or this value of the currency. They don't make sense at the reevaluation. And so some of those projects are going to fail or have to change or whatever. But that's good. Good night, Lengthy Arthur. Good night, Glenn. Thank you for watching. Thoughts on Alexander Durgin's fourth political theory? I don't know what that is, so no thoughts. Uh, Yeah, we did open borders last time for like an hour and a half. Oh, I'm caught up with the comments again. I'm really liking that the stream actually worked this time too. It's a nice change from the past. Oh my, oh my, oh my. Well, my friend is like his hookup postponed because of the Super Bowl. Sad times. Will we see at least a limited government state in our lifetimes? Well, you could argue that it's limited now, just not as much as it should be. In our lifetimes, see the problems in our lifetimes has that time scale because technology is changing so much at this point that I just think it's so hard to make any kind of valid prediction. So I just wouldn't lay odds. I definitely think it could happen, but I don't know what the odds are. Um, Dugin, liberalism, communism, and fascism defined the 20th century, with liberalism winning in 1945 and again in 1989. Durgin's fourth theory is the search for something new. So this would be kind of like opposed to Francis Fukuyama saying that history's ended and liberalism is the answer for all time. He's now saying, well, it won, but now who's going to win next? So I don't know if I'd have to read more about it, like to say. Obviously, 45 and 89 are big years in terms of political philosophy for sure, but what degree did liberalism win those? That's a good question. Azar Gott raises some very he questions some of those assumptions actually quite strongly in on War and Human Civilization, because he does talk about, yes, the Allies won World War II, but a lot of that was coincidences of geography and how they were set up, and just the material advantages of the Allies were so overwhelming that they were bound to win that war under most circumstances. And he thought that fascist Germany, not the communists, but the fascist Germans, were able to marshal resources basically as effectively as liberalism was able to. So, in his mind, it's not clear that liberalism is superior, at least if we're talking about the ability to wage war. He thought that the Nazis were able to wage war as effectively as liberal societies were. Now, given the vastly inferior numbers and resources, they lost the war. And he does raise the point, well, maybe one of the reasons that there was this vast difference is because liberalism led to there being an advantage in terms of resources. Fair point, not one that he acknowledged without going into. So I think that there are maybe one or two. I think there's some unbacked assumptions in there about winning, that those are the only three, that sort of thing. So, but is the pro open borders position only possible in a libertarian world where the government has faded away? How could, well, no, the position is certainly possible without that. But it's less than optimal without that as well. So every new welfare program, every new regulation, every new restriction makes that less optimal. I haven't read Trump's peace plan in Palestine, so I don't know. I'm gonna guess that it's probably shitty and Zionist, though. If it's not Zionist, someone please tell me, but that would just be my assumption. Based on what we know about Trump and how he feels about that, and just how influential they are within the United States. And by when I say they, I mean Zionists, not Jews. Uh, but, 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 best argument against anarcho-capitalism. I would think that at the end of the day, the best argument is to say, why isn't it there now? Why do states proliferate so much if anarcho-capitalism is so great? I think that's the best argument. That's the hardest one to grapple with. Although there's certain things about that I think there's weaknesses in that argument. Because something's common is not necessarily proof that it's necessary. As I always point out, diseases are very common. Gonorrhea is very common. Organized crime is very common. Religions are very common, right? And most people would assume that you don't need those things, that they proliferate because they're good at proliferating, not because they're necessarily beneficial. But I do think that is the strongest argument against it. The other arguments that people invoke just I don't think are very strong. Like the idea that, well, people aren't angels. That doesn't prove anything. Or uh, I don't know. The arguments along those lines I never think are very persuasive. Or we're social animals. Yeah, we are social animals, but that are you justifying monarchy? Or are you justifying communism? Or what? How you organize matters. Who's banning billionaires? I think I missed some of these comments. Uh, du- 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 du. Alternative Hypothesis made an interesting video where Germany wins by simply becoming allies with Turkey and Iraq. Well, actually, Iraq did ally with Germany. I don't know if he did. Did he? I don't know if he realized that or not. But Iraq was technically an independent state. It was part of the British Empire, but it technically was an independent state, just like Egypt at the time. And they did actually declare for Germany, and they were actually reinforced. The Luftwaffe was able to get planes there from Vichy-controlled Syria, where and the British just conquered Iraq in about I think 2 weeks. So I don't know now. Turkey being involved could potentially have changed that some, but I think the evidence is pretty good that between the French and the English, or maybe even just the English, they could have neutralized that alliance pretty well. I don't know that the Turkish state at that time would have been able to stop the British invasion or whatever. But it's an interesting point, and I guess if you say, well, the Wehrmacht could have deployed lots of military units into Anatolia. Different story. You could have them getting into the Middle East, but then those units would not have been available for a war against the Soviet Union. And so then the Germans would have been in this extremely awkward position where they have a large military force, in Anatolia and in the Middle East, when they have a gigantic Soviet military force that's fully, you know, on their border, right? So that would be extremely, extremely dangerous. It's kind of, it reminds me of the Jefferson claim about slavery. It's like by holding a wolf by the ears, you don't like it, but you don't want to let it go. They were always in danger of a two-front war with the Soviet Union, and going to war in the Middle East would make that even more. They would be even more vulnerable because, yes, they would have oil. That would be wonderful for them, but the oil supplies would have been vulnerable because they're crossing. I mean, they have to cross the Bosphorus at one point. Those facilities would have been open for bombing and attack and submarines and whatever else, and just having their military forces devolved in that way. So Look, Hitler would have liked that. It ended up not happening. Turkey never allied with Germany in World War II, even in the heyday of their power. I think there's a reason for that. I think that they knew that they were not strong, that it would be horrible for Turkey to get into a war on either side. They eventually declared for the Allies in 1945 at the end. So the British were the British still the British Empire was declining, but they were still the hegemon of the Middle East, and they proved it in World War II. Which state could most likely secede from the USA today? California, Texas are both really good possibilities. Duh, duh, duh. Yeah, Texas I think is a good answer. Texas and Cali. And they both talk about it too for different reasons. I liked your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu video. I also liked your points on your music study learning onto your martial arts training. Yeah, it's people don't make that association, but basically music is the mastery of learning repetitive techniques and then putting them into sequence. So that's applicable. I find that the practice that I did for music was unlike any other kind of preparations that I did in my studies, where you would just go and hammer out over and 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 over again, even very simple things. Even when I had been doing it for 12 years, right? I'm a scholarship to college musician. I got a decent scholarship to go to a decent music school. 12 years in, I could spend 3 hours just doing the simplest, most elementary scale, right? The scale that you learn in the first week when you start. Even 12 years in, I could spend time practicing that and not get it perfect and spend hours and hours just on that one thing. And that's, like, but that there's a certain amount of discipline to that, and then that's how you become really good. You get a skill level, and I've heard Rogan say this, and I've heard a couple other people say that with like jujitsu, what happens, it tends to happen if you're going regularly, say you're going 5, 6, 7 hours a week or more, like every 6 months or so, you kind of get these epiphanies where the first 6 months you do learn a little bit, but you're very awkward and your movements are a little, uh, you know, not very fluid, and you've got to physically think, like you don't have muscle memory, you have to physically recall what to do. And then after 6 months, you get a certain degree of, oh, you're fluid, you remember how to act, you just kind of get some muscle memory, but then you kind of plateau again, and then 6 months later, or that's very rough. And of course, if you take a break from training, that's not going to be the case. But that's what happens, and you just see. I mean, you feel it. I remember feeling it, and I mean, I was practicing this Friday before I made that video actually, and it was very. I was just doing things that I was like, I do not think if I had seen this move done 2 years ago, I could not have done it. Right? I could not, like, the body coordination is just so much better now that I would not be able to do this, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, even if I practiced it for a couple weeks. Um, and so, and that's just mid-level training. I'm also thinking about there's actually a bluegrass band I like called the Sleepy Man Banjo Boys. They used to be called Banjo Boys, now they're called the Sleepy Man, and it's a trio of brothers. One plays the guitar, one plays the fiddle, and one plays the banjo. And they kind of got famous because they uploaded a video, and the youngest one plays banjo, and he's pretty good, and he's 8 in the video, and then the other brothers are older, and it got millions of views, right? And there's an interesting interview with one of the older brothers where they said, well, we got all these questions about why your 8-year-old brother is like a prodigy. And it's like, what they don't know is that when he was 8, he started playing when he was 6. So he'd been practicing for 2 years. And he's like, well, for those 2 years, he wasn't very good. I mean, if you listen to him, it was like boink, 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 ding, blink, not great, just really awkward. But he goes, he got better and better and better. And after 2 years, he can play good enough that your average person will be impressed. Now, Would a virtuoso banjo player have been impressed? No. Would a music, somebody who was a serious musician? Probably not. They might be impressed, like, oh, he's 8, he's doing well, but they wouldn't think it was amazing. But a layperson will, and I think that 2 years is a good amount to go from you don't know anything to you're good enough that the average person is going to be impressed. And that's true whether we're talking about harmonica or piano or Muay Thai. Oh my gosh, look at all these comments. Oh no, we're in the World War II shit now. Holy shit, guys. Wow. Okay, okay. I'm gonna have to blow through these. Um, it's a shame the South botched the war so badly. Would be great to have two different American countries. Yeah, the South. I'm now of the opinion that that was the South's war to lose, and they lost. I think that the relative population and industrial power of the North, which is well understood, in that time period and the way wars were fought back then, it didn't matter as much as people think now. And I think that the South very likely could have prevailed. And I think they squandered a huge amount of resources in their armies and deploying them and fighting them in these pitched battles. If they had gone straight defensive and reactive and guerrilla, the biggest fear of Sherman and Grant was that they would go guerrilla. They were terrified that would happen because the only solution they had would have been a brutal suppression of the population, which would have just destroyed the Union for who knows, probably forever, and also may not have led to military victory anyway. So it was theirs to lose. They lost it. There was one of, I think it was Alexander Toombs or Douglas Stevens, one of Jefferson Davis's arch rivals or critics, who said that it was West Point ideology that defeated the South, not because the North had great generals, but because the South bought into those ideologies that weren't effective in a defensive war. Have you ever read Anthony C. Sutton? Yes, I have. I have his trilogy, Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, and I've read the first volume, and I've also read he's got Wall Street and the Nazis, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, which I've read both of those, and then also National Suicide, which I have, but I've not read. So uh, his books on Western technology and Soviet economic development are some of the most important and iconoclastic books that I've ever read. I spent years trying to get copies of those books. They were super hard to find and super expensive. At one point, I had a photocopy that I got from a library for volume 3. I now have the whole thing. They're actually on that shelf back there. I'm pointing at them right there. Those four. That's actually them. That see that red binding on the top shelf. That's the third, and those two are the volumes 1 and 2. Uh, those books are the most well-researched, cited books I've ever read. And many years later, when I read Wages of Destruction by Adam Totes, he was retreading a lot of that material. And what's funny is that Totes' book is acclaimed and famous and it's assigned in colleges. And Sutton was marginalized and ignored, and nobody's ever heard of him. And conspiracy theory, blah, blah, blah. But I swear, Totes was just picking up the crumbs that Sutton left behind. So, yes, I have read Sutton, and I think his work is amazing. Ba-ba-ba. Hitler won World War II by 1941. Well, that's not true because he didn't defeat the UK by then, and it's likely he could not have defeated the UK in any kind of relevant timescale. Churchill was a war criminal. Yes, that's true. Of the big three, Churchill is the only one that might have had a conscience, but he is still a war criminal. Oh my gosh, I cannot keep up with this. World War II just really gets people talking, doesn't it? Would you ever think about breaking into web development as a career? I would think about it, but I haven't thought about it seriously. It has been argued that he launched against the Soviet Union just to get the Jews. That's bullshit. 100%. That is not true. Anyone who argues that is fucking full of shit. That is not the reason he went against the war in the Soviet Union. Now, was he happy to send the Einsatzgruppen to go and kill Jews in Russia? Yes, he was. That is not the reason they went to war in Russia. I mean, that's just totally wrong. Number one reason, it sounds weird, but he thought that the reason the UK was staying in the war was because they held out hope that the Soviet Union would enter the war. And as long as that hope remained, they would continue to fight. And the thing was, because of the Royal Air Force and because of the Royal Navy, the Germans did not have the means to invade Great Britain. And it was not going to be within their means for probably at least half a decade, right? In wartime conditions, maybe not ever. So it was the belief that if they could knock out the Soviet Union, which they believed that they could for ideological reasons, Hitler said, if you kick in the door, the house will collapse. There were good reasons to believe this. Unfortunately, they did not formulate a strategy based on trying to make that happen. When you launch a strategy to basically genocide the Slavs, they don't care if they're fighting for Stalin. They're going to fight for their lives. If they had come out and said, we're liberating you, we want to reinstitute some kind of democracy in Russia, we want to be your allies, we want to save you from the Bolsheviks, I think that they might have had a much better shot, but that's not what they did. So yeah, number one was to eliminate a potential ally from the UK, which would make them quit. Number two was the whole Lebensraum thing. That they wanted it anyway. They wanted to set up this large hegemonic market in Eastern Europe. That was number one. I do not think that eliminating the Jews even entered into it. Also, the huge problem with that theory is the Potsdam Conference for the Final Solution was at the end of 1941, the start of 1942, after the War with Russia has already started. So there's no way that was the reason. That's got to be one of the dumbest reasons I've ever heard, to be honest. And that is not to deny the Holocaust. They definitely wanted to kill the Jews. That's just not the reason they invaded the Soviet Union. What instrument could you play? So I learned to play all of them, but my principal instrument was clarinet, and then also to a lesser extent piano. Argument against anarcho-capitalism, the fear of the inevitable rise of government is compelling. Yes, I think that's a pretty good argument as well. But it's almost like saying, well, death is inevitable, so resisting death in the short term is stupid, right? Well, I beg to differ on both counts. But I do agree that is a good argument. It would have been really easy for Germans to recruit natives into the region into their military. Yeah, Mohammed, that may be true, but recruiting people into the Wehrmacht did not make them the Wehrmacht. All right, non-Germans who were drafted into the Wehrmacht were not as good soldiers as the Wehrmacht. Right? There's cultural things. If you read Lost Victories by Field Marshal Manstein about this, he talks about it, and he talks about their allies like the Romanians and the Hungarians. He goes, a Hungarian or a Romanian peasant is not a German. He's not saying this for ethnic reasons. He's saying this for cultural reasons. And they're not going, you can put on a German uniform and you can send them to 9 weeks of boot camp. That does not make them a German soldier. The same thing, the Americans have the same problem with the Afghan army today, right? We can go and just set up the same boot camp exactly like we have, at Fort Bragg or whatever, and make Afghans go to that. And that does not make a U.S. army in Afghanistan. And the same would be definitely true for Palestinians or Iraqis who somehow joined the German army, which there were North Africans who did, right, during the campaigns in Libya and Egypt. But yes, I mean, that doesn't mean they couldn't help and they couldn't do anything, but they were not. A million non-Germans joining the Wehrmacht does not make the Wehrmacht a million men stronger, That's interesting. So you think Stalin sees Germans diverting troops south into Middle East, then Stalin jumps? Yeah, I definitely think he would do that. Uh, the evidence is that he was waiting for some reason to do it. We don't know what the time scale was. Was he going to do it in 1941 or 1944? His, if you read Kotkin on Stalin, his ideology, he kind of thought that they were going to fight like World War One for 3 or 4 years, but obviously that's not what happened because France fall after less than 1 year. So, but yeah, they had gigantic armies, especially in an area called Bialystok. And they also had huge armies in the Caucasus, and people forget about this. But even even after the Wehrmacht made it all the way to Moscow, the Soviet armies in the Caucasus had not been denuded of troops. They were continuing to reinforce them. And so they had full strength peacetime army size units in the Caucasus and in Siberia. Famously, they transferred the Siberian ones for the counterattack in the winter of 1941 at the outskirts of Moscow, which, by the way, that defeat at the end of 1941 was worse than Stalingrad, right? The German army lost something like, I'm going to say this wrong, but thousands and thousands of towns and villages, like a huge area. They lost an area probably bigger than Great Britain uh, in the winter of 1941. But through that entire period, the Soviets still had gigantic armies in the Caucasus, right? So what do you think those were there for, right? They probably, if the Germans had allied with Turkey, if the Germans had invaded, this is probably why the I haven't read this, but I know that the Soviets had armies in the Caucasus. If the Turks had allied with the Germans, the Russians would have invaded Anatolia immediately, and the Turks knew that. And so that was just not going to happen. And if they had allied anyway, well, it's not just a walk in the park where the Wehrmacht is going to go and smash the British army in the Middle East. Nope, now we're talking about the Soviet Union fighting a war in the Middle East as well. So I think that that scenario is extremely unlikely. But the federal government would never allow California to secede without violence. I don't know if the federal government can convince enough people to fight and die to stop secession anymore, like they were in the 1860s. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure that that's true anymore. The Allies won because of Texas plus Baku. There's some truth to that. To them, Bolshevism and Judaism was one and the same and had to be destroyed. Okay, yeah, so I do not agree that Bolshevism and Judaism is one and the same, although highly overlapped. But I think that is fair to say that in Hitler's opinion and Nazi thinking, that would have been true. And they could have made it, they did make this, they should have done this more. They should have been, Bolshevism is a parasite upon Russia, which is true, whether you want to consider that Jewish or not. Bolshevism was a parasite on Russia. Maybe it still is, depending who you ask. And I think that they should have played that up much more than they did. Did you see Rogan came out as an activist? Yes, he's kind of famous for that at this point. Your great grandfather was conscripted in the Ottoman Empire and Palestine to fight the British in Gaza. Oh, interesting. They're running trains empty in Russia to grab Jews instead of running supplies to the military in the end. Does that sound like somebody who wants? Yeah, it's a good point. I don't, but none of the death camps I don't think were in Russia, so they wouldn't have been running trains there. They were in Poland and Germany and Czechoslovakia and stuff. Um, so yeah. Have you ever read Anthony Sutton? Didn't I just talk about that? Congrats on the winning sports ball team. Good job. Alexander Stevens and Robert Toombs agree the Civil War should be fought. No, so the problem that they're probably right, but on the other hand, they hated West Point and they hated Jefferson Davis, and they considered Jefferson Davis to be part of a West Point clique, and they were highly political in their disagreements. So their assessments should not be considered unbiased, right? Um, this would be like Bernie Sanders criticizing Trump and saying, we should have an army based on Soviets and communes, right? May or may not be true, but they're not an objective observer. But yes, that is very likely true. I know that Grant and Sherman, that was their biggest fear because they really didn't have a good way to deal with that. Uh, as Nathan Bedford Forrest showed it, and this was actually true throughout the war, and people don't tend to understand this very well. The North had a very hard time maintaining forces more than 80 miles from any major, either a river or from the coast. Now, 80 miles from a major river or the coast is a big chunk of the South, but anything beyond that, railroad connections were just too easy to be destroyed by cavalry or irregular militia, too difficult to police. So logistically, forces that were deployed beyond that range were very, very vulnerable. And so things like Sherman's March to the Sea, that's a raid. They're not actually holding that territory. They're just marching through it and living off the land. But if they had stopped, they would have starved for lack of supplies eventually. So most of the South could not be occupied by the North under any even under non-resisting circumstances, and any kind of resistance would have made that very difficult. So, but didn't Hitler offer to let America take the Jews, and Roosevelt said no? Okay, so there's at least one example of a ship, at least one ship that did go to America and was turned back. Now, I don't know if Hitler was personally involved. I do believe that Roosevelt was personally involved. And there is a whole book titled FDR and the Holocaust. And basically, the idea is that this definitely was not a war to fought to help the Jews or to stop the Holocaust, however it was then understood. That was definitely not the point. Um, they knew the camps were there. The Air Force talked about bombing them, and that was not a priority, and so they didn't do it. Uh, so, no. If it's more than that, I don't know. I forget the name. There's a name of that ship. It's famous. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But the South was doomed when they instituted conscription and demoralized everyone. So I would recommend Why the South Lost the War is a good book. This is a series of essays taking all these. What seemed to be more demoralizing was a couple major military defeats, especially Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The South, which is very evangelical Presbyterian, they believed that the Creator God was actively involved in society, and so when they had a victory, it was because God was showing their favor, and when they had a defeat, it was because God was chastising them. And then there became the question of why would God be chastising us? And of course, the most salient, debated, hot topic, moral issue for the last 30 years at least have been slavery. And I think it was Mary Chestnut or maybe Robert Fitzhume, but there were several pro slavery people who said, look, even the people who say they believe in slavery, deep down, there's a part of them that thinks, wow, this might be wrong, right? The arguments against it were so salient that even people who did, honestly did believe it, they had doubts, right? Well, if you believe, if you have any doubt at all, and then you lose a big battle at like Gettysburg, which by the way was like a strategic, stalemate. It didn't defeat like Lee invades Pennsylvania. He fights a big battle. He does lose a lot of men, which was very wasteful for a country on their resources. And then he retreats back to Virginia. But within I think it was in like just a couple months they replaced the soldiers. They still had manpower reserves for that. But what was it? But they look at it like God is obviously mad about something. And there was debate. Some people thought, well, maybe God is mad because we don't treat the slaves as well as we should. But I think most people would have been like, yeah, that sounds like bullshit. It's probably because slavery's wrong. And then the thing is, if slavery's wrong, what the fuck are we doing? What was the point of this? So that was demoralizing. But the inflation didn't help. The lack of a political opposition didn't help. There's only one party. There's one party rule in the South, basically. So that's a really good book. Why the South Lost the War. I would highly recommend anyone interested to read. Uh, France fell in a few weeks. Well, the war started in September 1939, and France was invaded in May 1940 and fell in June 1940. So, but yes, the actual invasion, I think it took 6 weeks. I've seen firsthand the so-called Afghan army. They're about as good as cavemen. Yeah, but this is an interesting thing. You can't just take them and put them into a U.S. boot camp. I bet if you even if you flew them to America and sent them to a boot camp in America, it wouldn't be the same. And that's not a dig against them. It's just that is a different culture. It's a different population. The institutions in the United States are set up for the United States. I'm sure if you took an American soldier and dropped him off in, I don't know, an Uzbek clan, he wouldn't get along as well. So duh, duh, duh. Yeah, I agree. It's better to own books physically. You ever watched The Expanse? I've never seen it. Seen commercials for it, but I've never watched it. In Oz, specifically my state, Queensland, humanities are disappearing, and my state philosophy is, well, all that stuff is subsidized by the government. So if it disappears, that's good, right? Uh, that's definitely a positive. I'd like to see the universities add more intersectional feminist trans classes. Do you think there will be a future for other cryptocurrencies besides Bitcoin? So this is a technical question on which I am not the best to answer, but when I have listened to people who know a whole lot more than me, who seem intellectually honest and not biased by some kind of ulterior motive, I think it is very likely other types of cryptocurrency will be developed that are functionally superior to Bitcoin at some point. Whatever they are, though, you will be able to buy them with Bitcoin. Have you listened to Scott Horton's show with a Christian pastor? Gave me a lot of talking points to talk to evangelical Christians on war, Islam, and Israel. Uh, no, I haven't seen that. Is there a name of the Christian pastor? I'd actually like to hear that. Do you think that the university will become a relic like the church? Not if the government has anything to say about it. Funny enough, I knew an Uzbek girl and her father was a soldier too. See, what would actually win a war in Afghanistan besides nuking everybody? What could do it is if they colonized it, right? If they just said, okay, uh, poor Americans, you can go. If they just had some kind of thing where they're like, you can move there and there's no taxes or whatever, and 1 million Americans moved to Afghanistan, and they started mixing with the people and creating an Anglo-Afghan culture, then that could stick around and they could know the lay of the land and they would be interested, right? They're not just there for a 1 year rotation or a short term political strategy, or some stupid general who's like, what kind of quantitative statistical policy am I going to have that I can then brag about to get a promotion? You would actually have people who want to stay, and they'd have presumably some kind of affinity with America or whatever, right? You basically do the Alexander the Great route, and you can end up with a you know Anglo Af or Amero-Afghan state. But see, that's all illegal, and you can't do that anymore. Like that's just not kosher at this point. I think that's the only way, other than like nuking it, that would actually work. But again, I don't think they have any actual like goal that makes coherent sense. So All right, guys. Now I'm getting tired. I have to get up early tomorrow. So if there's any final questions, let me know. I'll give it about a minute. Uh, didn't work for the Greeks, did it? Well, you say that, but some of those Greek kingdoms lasted for like 200 years. So there were a couple Greco-Bactrian kingdoms, Greco-Indian kingdoms that lasted for hundreds of years. So you can say it didn't work, but it actually lasted for a long time. The Alexandrian Empire did fall apart pretty quick, but the successor states, some of them lasted a long time. We're not, in fact, some of them we're not sure how long they lasted, but they lasted at least for like 100 years, 200 years, maybe more. Famously, the Indian king Ashoka, I think I'm saying that right. He would on his stela and a lot of his inscriptions, they would be obviously in Sanskrit and whatever other Hindi languages, but then they'd also have Greek versions. So it was still a language that was being spoken like in the Punjab and in the Indus. So I've been listening for like 3 hours. Well, yeah, it's 2 hours and 57 minutes. Thanks for listening. Thanks for the stream. Thanks for listening, John. What's your favorite libertarian book of all time? That's my easy answer for that is The Problem of Political Authority by Michael Huemer. It's cliche for me to say that at this point, but it's still the best. Maybe if the South had won, circumcision would not have caught on. Maybe not. You don't assimilate the Middle East; it assimilates you. Maybe true. But how many of them watch American television and drink soda pop? Nighty night. Okay, I got 2 minutes for 3 hours, so I'm going to go for that. Good night. Thank you, comrade. Thanks, Sean Pierre. One minute, 30 seconds. Last call. One minute. 24 people watching. What are you waiting for? Good night, Tortoise. I'll see you when you move back. Coke or Pepsi? Pop. Is Forging realistic? I don't think it is at this point. They need more money. Cherry Coke. And 3, 2, 1. All right, guys. Good night and happy sports.